For thousands of years, traces of lost civilizations have remained scattered across deserts, mountains, and forgotten jungles. Massive stone structures, underground cities carved by hand, and ancient artifacts so advanced that researchers still debate how they were made. Yet the mysteries never disappeared. Who built these sites? What knowledge did they possess? And why do so many of their secrets seem intentionally hidden from history? Join us on a 3-hour journey through the most perplexing sites ever uncovered, places that may yet challenge the boundaries of what we believe possible. Let's uncover the unknown. The ground here does not behave like ground. It curves downward without apology. A vast, bowl-shaped depression sunk into the Surrey heathland of southern England, fringed by silver birch and heather that clings to the rim like an audience leaning in. The air inside sits differently, somehow stiller, as though the landscape has folded in on itself to protect something it has not yet decided to reveal. Fog pools in the basin on autumn mornings. Birds avoid the center. This is the Devil's Punch Bowl, locally also called the Devil's Soup Bowl, a dramatic natural amphitheater carved into the Hindhead Common near Thursley in Surrey. The hollow measures roughly 1 kilometer across and drops significantly below the surrounding plateau, making it one of the most visually arresting landforms in southern Britain. Walkers have passed its rim for generations, and yet even in an age of geological explanation, something about this particular depression resists easy dismissal. Its scale feels intentional. Its depth feels pointed. What unsettles investigators is not the bowl itself, which geologists attribute to periglacial processes during the last ice age, but the centuries of persistent folklore layered so thickly over the landscape that the stories begin to feel like sediment, structural, not decorative. The hollow has been associated with devil worship, ritual gathering, and strange disappearances since at least the medieval period. A gibbet once stood at the nearby crossroads where 3 men were hanged for murder in 1786, their bodies left to rot as warning, and locals maintained for decades that the hollow drew violent energy toward itself like a drain. What compelled so many unconnected generations to return to this specific geometry for ritual and dread? And why does the site's reputation for the uncanny predate any recorded history? The heathland surrounding the bowl was inhabited as far back as the Mesolithic period, with evidence of flint tool production found in the wider Hindhead region. Bronze Age peoples moved through this corridor between the Thames Basin and the southern coast, and later Iron Age communities would have known this hollow intimately as a waypoint, a shelter, a landmark visible in the memory of the land long before maps. Ritual use of dramatic natural landforms was common across prehistoric Britain. Hilltops, springs, caves, and natural bowls were frequently understood as thresholds between the visible world and whatever moved beneath it. The prevailing scholarly reading is straightforward in geological terms. The bowl formed through solifluction during Pleistocene freeze-thaw cycles, when saturated soil flowed downslope and hollowed out the sandstone beneath. Archaeologists note that the folklore accretion is culturally explicable. Dramatic landforms attract dramatic stories, and a prominent hollow near a well-traveled road naturally becomes a landmark for dark associations. The gibbet only deepened what was already there, but others propose that the bowl's near-perfect circular geometry and its consistent orientation within the heathland topography may indicate that prehistoric communities understood it as a cosmological anchor, a place where the earth had opened its mouth, symbolically speaking, and invited communication with the underworld. circular depressions in many cultures worldwide carry specific ritual meanings. A wound in the earth, a navel, a listening ear pressed into the soil. Perhaps this was not merely a frightening place, but a sacred one, where the membrane between worlds felt thinner. Some researchers working at the fringes of archaeoacoustics have noted that bowl-shaped natural depressions can create unusual sound phenomena, voices that carry, echoes that arrive from unexpected directions, a quality of resonance that has no obvious explanation to the uninitiated ear. Could early communities have selected this hollow, not despite its strangeness, but because of it? Was the acoustic behavior of the landscape itself the reason for the site's long gravity? Why do the stories persist even among people who have never heard them before? Why does the site appear in legal and ecclesiastical records always in connection with something disturbing, something hidden? What happens to the memory of a place that is never written down, only felt? How many other natural formations across Britain have accumulated the same invisible weight and gone unrecorded simply because no gibbet forced them onto paper? The Devil's Soup Bowl is, in the end, a mirror. It reflects back at us something about the relationship between landscape and dread. The way human beings have always sensed that the earth is not neutral, that particular geometries of the natural world carry frequencies the body registers before the mind finds words for them. We have explained the geology. We have not explained the persistent unease. And there is a difference between those two things, even if we cannot yet measure it. From the cold heather of Surrey, we now cross the Mediterranean and descend into the deserts of the Middle East, where the mystery grows older and the structures grow stranger. In the basalt plains of Jordan, something waits that has no clear parallel anywhere on Earth. Flat. Brutally, absolutely flat. The basalt plain of the Jordanian Harat unfolds in every direction, like a dark table set for no one. The volcanic rock underfoot black as char, the sky above it enormous and indifferent. In summer, the heat lifts invisible waves off the stone. In winter, the cold comes sideways. Nothing softens this landscape. Not the sparse thorn scrub, not the distant rumple of hills, not the occasional track worn into the rock by tires that did not exist when the things out here were made. Scattered across this Jordanian and Syrian basalt desert, barely visible from the ground and fully comprehensible only from above, are what researchers now call the big circles, enormous geometric enclosures formed from low stone walls, each measuring between 150 and 400 meters in diameter, some of them among the largest known prehistoric stone structures in the Middle East. There are at least 11 confirmed examples, most concentrated in the Azraq Basin and the broader Black Desert region. The walls stand no more than a meter high. There are no gates, no obvious interior features, no hearths, no middens, no evidence of sustained habitation. They appear to be rings for rings' sake, purposeful, enormous, and mute. What makes the big circles genuinely confounding is not their size but their design logic. The walls are too low to serve as corrals. Livestock would simply walk over them. They are too thin to be defensive. Their interiors show no structural remains that would suggest shelter, ceremony, or industry. Aerial survey by the Aerial Photographic Archive for Archaeology in the Middle East brought several to scholarly attention only in the late 20th century, and despite subsequent ground surveys, the circles have produced almost no artifactual material whatsoever. Their age is estimated from comparison to nearby dated sites and landscape context. most likely Neolithic or Bronze Age, perhaps as much as 5,000 years old. So what were these rings for? And who, in a landscape this vast and empty, would have had both the reason and the workforce to build them? The Neolithic communities of the Levantine interior were among the most consequential in human prehistory. The people of this broader region were among the first to domesticate plants and animals, to build permanent villages, to develop complex exchange networks that stretched from the Anatolian highlands to the Sinai. The basalt desert was not uninhabited. Sites like Azraq evidence repeated human use across tens of thousands of years. The builders of the circles were likely semi-nomadic pastoralists whose seasonal movements followed water and grazing, and who understood this landscape at a spatial scale and with a navigational precision that modern visitors can barely imagine. The most widely accepted interpretation among archaeologists is functional. The circles served as animal traps or seasonal management enclosures, with the low walls acting as a visual and physical guide rather than a hard barrier. Some researchers point to the broader tradition of desert kite structures across the region, stone-walled funnel systems used to drive gazelle toward kill zones, as evidence that prehistoric peoples of the Levant understood landscape geometry as a tool of resource management at extraordinary scale. Yet others are drawn to a different reading entirely. Circles inscribed in the earth carry deep cosmological weight in many ancient traditions, and the near-perfect geometry of some examples, achievable only with planning and not guesswork, suggests that whoever measured these rings possessed both the motivation and the methodology to create something that meant more than utility. Perhaps the circles mapped something celestial, a horizon calendar, a solar marker, a ring of sky pressed into stone as an act of devotion to a cosmology we have not recovered. Then again, there are those who note that the sheer uniformity of the big circles across hundreds of kilometers of desert, consistent diameter ranges, consistent wall height, consistent absence of internal features, implies a shared intellectual or cultural blueprint. Was there a school of thought, a tradition of landscape inscription that transmitted this specific form across generations and geographies without our having found any other trace of it? What civilization teaches its children to build rings this large and then leaves no other record? Why is the interior always empty? Were the circles meant to be seen from above? And if so, by what or whom? How did communities without written language, without metal tools, coordinate the labor and the geometry across a landscape that offers no natural focal points? And what has erased every other trace of the people who made them? The big circles remain open questions pressed into the desert floor. They are patient, as stone always is. Whatever they once communicated, to neighbors, to the sky, to something that moved through the dark above the basalt plain, has not yet been translated. The walls stand low, the interiors breathe, and the silence inside each ring has the quality of an answer that nobody knows how to hear. Now we leave the volcanic desert and travel northwest, to the gray, rain-soaked flatlands of Scotland's Clyde estuary, where a different kind of inscription covers a single flat stone with a language no living person has learned to read. Rain. Always rain, or the memory of it. The grass on Faifley Hill in West Dunbartonshire is the deep, saturated green that only comes from months of sky water pressing down. The land is low and wide here, close to the Clyde, and the hills roll without drama. It is not a landscape that announces itself. You might walk straight past the field where the stone lies buried and feel nothing at all. But beneath approximately 60 centimeters of turf, deliberately reinterred in 1965 to protect it from vandalism, lies something that has no satisfying explanation. The Kokno stone is a flat sandstone slab, measuring approximately 7.9 by 4.2 meters, lying near Clydebank in West Dunbartonshire, Scotland, and it carries one of the most complex concentrations of prehistoric cup and ring marks ever recorded on a single surface. Over 90 individual motifs have been catalogued: concentric rings, grooves, spirals, channels, and interconnected geometries, carved into the rock surface sometime in the Neolithic or Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. When it was first formally documented by Reverend James Harvey in 1887, it was already considered extraordinary. Nothing quite like it exists at the same density anywhere else in Scotland. The cup and ring marks themselves are the central enigma. Cup and ring carvings appear across the prehistoric Atlantic world: Ireland, Brittany, northern Spain, Scandinavia. But the Kokno stone's arrangement is unusual in both its density and its apparent internal coherence. Some marks appear to be connected by carved channels. Others seem to radiate outward from central cups in ways that suggest deliberate spatial organization rather than accumulated individual acts of carving. What compelled whoever made this to concentrate so much symbolic energy onto one surface? And does the arrangement encode information, celestial, territorial, ritual, that we simply lack the framework to decode? The broader culture responsible for the Kokno stone belongs to the Atlantic Neolithic tradition, communities bound not by a single language or polity, but by shared practices of monument building, long-distance maritime exchange, and a relationship to the ancestral dead that expressed itself in stone. Passage tombs, standing stones, and rock art sites cluster along the Atlantic seaboard in ways that suggest a cosmological worldview attentive to horizon events, astronomical cycles, and the structured movement of the living through landscapes marked by the work of those who came before. Academic consensus treats cup and ring marks as symbolic or ritual in function, markers of territorial boundaries, cosmological diagrams, or accumulative records of repeated visits to places understood as sacred. The location of the Kokno stone on relatively level ground, with sight lines to surrounding hills, is consistent with other Scottish rock art sites, and the presence of water in the carved cups, which collect rainwater naturally, may have been part of its intended use, as reflective pools or offering basins. A more spiritually oriented reading suggests that the interconnected channels between cups may represent flows of energy or meaning, a map not of geographical terrain, but of invisible relationships between places, people, and the sky. In many indigenous traditions worldwide, rock art surfaces are understood not as records, but as living surfaces, interfaces between the physical and the spirit world. Perhaps the Kokno stone was a communication device, in the most literal sense its makers understood. A small number of researchers have drawn comparisons between the Kokno stone's most complex motifs and astronomical phenomena, specific arrangements of stars, or the spiral path of the sun at particular times of year, raising the possibility that the stone served as a calendrical instrument, encoding seasonal knowledge in symbolic geometry. The precision required for some of the more elaborate ring arrangements is, at minimum, consistent with careful measurement. Was the stone used by one community, or many over many generations? Do the overlapping marks represent different hands across centuries, each adding to a conversation they could hear but only partially read. Is the reburial of the stone under turf a blessing or a tragedy? Preservation or concealment? What happens to knowledge encoded in stone when the community that could interpret it disappears? The Cockno stone sleeps beneath its turf blanket somewhere under a Scottish field, and the rain continues to fall on the grass above it. In its stillness, it is not waiting for archaeology. It has already outlasted several editions of archaeology. What it is waiting for, if it is waiting for anything, is a question that belongs to the future, not to us. Scotland fades behind us as we descend south and plunge beneath the surface of the Aegean Sea, where an entire city has been lying on the seafloor for 3,000 years, waiting for someone to look down. The water here is clear enough to humiliate you. Off the southern coast of Laconia, near the small fishing village of Elafonisos in Greece, the Aegean shallows run so transparent that from a boat you can watch your shadow move across the sea floor 5 meters below. The bottom is sandy, broken by dark shapes, lines that are too straight, corners that are too deliberate. Fish drift through rooms that were once walls. You are looking at streets. Pavlopetri is an underwater Bronze Age city, submerged off the Peloponnese coast of southern Greece, and at roughly 5,000 years old, it is one of the oldest known submerged towns in the world. The site covers an area of approximately 30,000 square meters and includes the remains of streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs, and what appear to be ceremonial spaces. It predates the classical Greek period by millennia. Its occupation spans from at least the early Bronze Age through the Mycenaean period, meaning that people lived, traded, and died here, while the pharaohs of Egypt's New Kingdom were still building their empire. The most arresting discovery at Pavlopetri is not a single artifact, but the completeness of the urban layout itself. The site preserves what appear to be at least 15 buildings, with multiple rooms, 2-story structures in some cases, along with a network of streets and a large hall that some researchers believe may have served an administrative or ceremonial function. Pottery, stone tools, and other artifacts have been recovered across multiple periods of occupation. What defies straightforward explanation is how a settlement of this scale and organizational complexity, contemporary with some of the earliest known cities anywhere in the world, managed to develop on the edge of the Greek mainland and then vanish so completely that it was unknown to scholarship until 1967. Who were the people who organized this space so carefully? And what happened to the city that made the sea the only archive of its existence? The Mycenaean civilization, which occupied Pavlopetri in its later phases, was one of the great Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean, builders of the palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, traders who sent ships as far as Egypt and the Levant, and warriors whose deeds fed into the oral traditions that eventually became the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the earlier layers of Pavlopetri predate the Mycenaeans, reaching back into the early and Middle Bronze Age when Aegean civilization was still assembling its vocabulary. Mainstream archaeology explains the submersion of Pavlopetri through a combination of eustatic sea level rise and local tectonic subsidence. The sea in this region has risen, and the coastline has sunk since the Bronze Age, swallowing settlements that were once perfectly viable. This is a well-documented phenomenon across the Mediterranean, and Pavlopetri fits the pattern. The city was not destroyed by catastrophe. It was gradually abandoned as water encroached, and time did the rest. Some scholars working on the site's spatial organization suggest that Pavlopetri's layout reflects a sophisticated urban planning philosophy. Its streets, drainage systems, and building orientations show a level of civic intentionality that implies not improvisation, but design. Perhaps the city was conceived as a model space, a planned community whose physical arrangement embodied a specific social order, a cosmological geometry pressed into the ground, the same impulse we see at Çatalhöyük, at Mohenjo-Daro, at a dozen other Bronze Age urban experiments. Others have noted that certain architectural alignments at the site correspond to solstice sunrise directions, raising the speculative possibility that the city's founders were as interested in celestial orientation as in practical urban function, that living in a correctly oriented city was, in their understanding, a form of participation in cosmic order. How many more Bronze Age coastal settlements lie beneath the Mediterranean's shallower waters, uncatalogued and unexamined? What do the Pavlopetri artifacts tell us about trade networks that archaeology has not yet fully mapped? How did knowledge of the city survive, or did it? And if Homer's epics drew on memories of real Bronze Age places, could Pavlopetri, ancient even to the ancient Greeks, have been part of that deep memory? The streets of Pavlopetri are not ruins in the conventional sense. Ruins imply collapse. These walls stand in their way, softened by algae, measured by the pressure of water, but still describing the shape of a human idea about space and community. That idea is 3,000 years old at minimum, and it still works underwater. From the Aegean's ancient depths, we ascend into the North Atlantic, to a wind-battered pinnacle of rock off the coast of Ireland, where monks built something extraordinary at the edge of the known world. The Atlantic does not offer this place gently. 8 miles off the Kerry coast of Ireland, Skellig Michael rises from the ocean as a series of near-vertical rock faces, 660 feet of quartzite and sandstone, almost knife-edged at its peak, the waves breaking at its base with a sound like heavy artillery. There are gannets here by the tens of thousands. The wind is structural. The stone glistens with spray even on clear days. To reach the summit, you must climb 618 hand-cut stone steps, and at the top, at the absolute summit of this impossible outcrop, there are dry stone beehive cells that have stood for 1,400 years. Skellig Michael, located off the Iveragh Peninsula in County Kerry, Ireland, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site containing one of the best preserved early Christian monastic settlements in the world. Founded sometime between the 6th and 8th centuries A.D., the monastery clings to the south peak of the island at a height of approximately 200 meters above sea level. 6 corbelled stone cells, clochans, and 2 boat-shaped oratories are arranged on a series of man-made terraces carved into the rock face, interconnected by those ancient steps. The community that lived here, isolated from the European continent by hundreds of miles of open water, maintained a tradition of scholarship, illumination, and devotion that helped preserve classical learning through Europe's most intellectually turbulent centuries. The perplexing dimension of Skellig Michael is not what the monks did here: prayer, study, fasting, copying manuscripts, but how they chose here at all, and what sustained the choice for over 600 years. The logistics of establishing and maintaining a monastic community on a sea stack of this character border on the incomprehensible. Every stone used in construction was either quarried from the island itself or transported across 8 miles of open Atlantic. Fresh water was collected from rainfall, food was supplemented by what the surrounding ocean could provide. Viking raids struck the island at least twice, in 812 and 823 AD, killing monks and taking others as slaves. And yet the community returned. What drove men to seek God in a place this deliberately, almost insultingly, extreme? And what did they believe the extremity itself was doing for them spiritually? Early Irish monasticism drew on a theological tradition that understood physical suffering as spiritual fuel. The concept of the white martyrdom, the self-chosen exile into wild places as an act of devotion, equivalent to the red martyrdom of actual death. The founders of Skellig Michael belonged to a tradition that looked at the harshest corner of the known world and saw in it not an obstacle, but an invitation. The Irish peregrinati, wandering monks who colonized remote islands across the North Atlantic, understood displacement itself as a form of prayer. Scholars broadly agree that Skellig Michael represents the fullest expression of the Irish anchoritic tradition, a spirituality more indebted to the desert fathers of Egypt and Syria than to the broader European church, one that believed holiness required removal from the comfortable world. The beehive cells, the stepped terraces, the dedication to a landscape that offers no comfort. All of these cohere as a theological statement made in stone and labor. The symbolic reading goes further. The island was not chosen despite its inaccessibility, but because of it. Standing between the known world and the infinite ocean, the edge of the medieval map, beyond which there was either nothing or everything, Skellig Michael was, to its inhabitants, a threshold site. The last land before the divine. A place close enough to the edge of creation that whatever barrier separated the human from the sacred had worn thin. Some researchers have noted astronomical alignments in the placement of the terraces and the orientation of the oratories that may have allowed the monks to observe solstice and equinox events with unusual precision, raising the question of whether the site's astronomical consciousness preceded Christianity entirely, and whether the monks were settling on a place already understood by pre-Christian communities as cosmologically significant. How did the original founders survive the first winter? What was the manuscript tradition that developed on this rock? And what was lost when Viking raiding disrupted the community? Did the monks understand their island as a model of the universe, or simply as the hardest possible place to love God? And what does it mean for a tradition of learning that the most isolated possible scriptorium was also, apparently, one of the most productive? Skellig Michael is an argument made in stone. That meaning is worth discomfort, that the extreme edge of the habitable world is not a place to avoid, but a place to inhabit fully, deliberately, at whatever cost. The beehive cells still stand, the steps still climb, the birds still spiral above the peak in their thousands, indifferent to the centuries they have witnessed. Skellig's ocean mist dissolves behind us as we cross a continent and a sea, to reach the northeastern coast of Scotland, where a medieval fortress rises from a sea cliff so sheer it seems to have been placed there by force of will rather than engineering. The North Sea is gray today. It is usually gray, and it drives against the base of the promontory in long, methodical surges that have been wearing at the rock for longer than anything built upon it. The cliff rises 90 feet from the water, sheer on 3 sides. On the 4th, a narrow neck of land connects the rock stack to the mainland, defended by a gatehouse and a ditch. On the plateau above all of this, still standing, still inhabited by wind and rooks, are the remains of one of the most dramatically sited fortresses in all of Europe. Dunnottar Castle stands on a headland approximately 2 miles south of Stonehaven, on the Aberdeenshire coast of Scotland, its ruins occupying an almost entirely sea-girt promontory of old red sandstone that has been in use as a defensive site since at least the early medieval period. The castle, in its current form, dates largely from the 14th to 17th centuries, but the site's recorded history begins with a Pictish fort referenced in sources from the late first millennium, and its strategic logic, a near island connected to the mainland by the narrowest possible corridor, would have been obvious to any military mind across any era of Scottish history. What makes Dunnottar genuinely unsettling as a historical site is the density of catastrophe layered into its walls. This was the place where William Wallace besieged the English garrison in 1297, burning the church where the soldiers had taken shelter, with the soldiers still inside. It was here, in 1651, that the honours of Scotland, the oldest surviving crown jewels in Britain, were smuggled out past Cromwell's besieging army, lowered over the sea cliff in a basket, carried by a woman posing as a kelp gatherer. In 1685, over 160 Covenanting prisoners were crammed into a dungeon, here in conditions so appalling that dozens died, an episode now known as the Whigs' Vault. What compels this particular piece of rock to appear again and again at the hinge of Scottish history? And is the site's long record of extremity a function of geography, the sheer utility of its position, or does the landscape itself attract a certain quality of human event? The Picts, who first fortified this headland, were one of the most culturally distinctive peoples of late Iron Age and early medieval Scotland, builders of decorated symbol stones, practitioners of a tattoo art tradition so elaborate that it prompted Roman commentary, warriors whose resistance to Roman expansion effectively defined the northern boundary of empire. Their selection of Dunnottar's promontory followed a logic of defensive landscape, reading that was already millennia old by the time they applied it here. Academic historians treat Dunnottar primarily as a straightforward case study in Scottish military architecture and the strategic geography of the Aberdeenshire coast. Its repeated significance in national crises, Wallace, the Honours, the Covenanters, is explained by its reputation as an essentially impregnable position that could hold against siege, making it the natural destination for whatever was most precious or most dangerous in any given century. But the symbolic dimensions of the site are difficult to dismiss entirely. A fortress on an almost island at the edge of Scotland's eastern coast, regularly chosen as the repository for the things a nation most wanted to protect or most feared to lose, there is something about Dunnottar that functions less as a military installation and more as a reliquary, a container for the most charged objects and episodes of a culture's inner life. Some local traditions, never fully substantiated, hold that the promontory was in use as a ritual site long before the Picts, that the particular quality of isolation it offers, surrounded on three sides by the sea's horizontal infinity, made it a place where something other than war had been practiced in the deeper past. There is no archaeological proof, but there is, in places like Dunnottar, a quality of presence that precedes any specific history. How many times was the castle taken, and how many of those captures were betrayals from within? What happened to the people in the Whigs' Vault, the ones who survived, and where did they go? Does the woman who carried the honours down the sea cliff have a name? And what does Scotland's repeated choice of this particular rock as a repository for its most sacred objects tell us about the relationship between extremity and meaning, between the edge of the land and the core of a national identity? Donatar does not invite sentiment. The wind off the North Sea strips most of that away before it can settle. What remains is something older and harder. The knowledge that human beings have come to this cliff's edge in their most desperate moments for at least 1,500 years, and that the rock, indifferent to all of it, has held. We leave Scotland's stone-cold coast and fly east across the Eurasian landmass, descending into the ancient forests of Japan's Boso Peninsula, where a mountain has been carved by hands that left no name behind. Japan softens everything at first. The coastal forests below the Boso Peninsula are green in a specific layered way. Cedar, oak, and pine in tiers, the light coming through in vertical strips, the ground below perpetually damp and dense with moss. But climb the mountain called Nokogiri. Saw a mountain for the jagged silhouette of its ridgeline, and the forest gives way to something that makes the softness irrelevant. The rock here has been cut, not eroded. Cut in vertical faces by tools over centuries, with a precision that turns the entire hillside into an argument about human capability. Mount Nokogiri, rising 329 meters on the Boso Peninsula of Chiba Prefecture in Japan, is the site of one of the most extensive rock-cut landscapes in East Asia. Quarrying operations here, which extracted a stone called Hokyozan Ishi, used extensively in the construction of Edo period, 1603 to 1868 buildings, produced near-vertical cliff faces and deep galleries cut into the mountain's interior that now give the site its most dramatic vistas. But it is not the quarrying alone that draws visitors and researchers. It is what was made in the spaces between and within the extraction. Hundreds of carved Buddhist figures, a 16-meter recumbent Yakushi Nyorai, the Buddha of healing, a large sculpted face known as the Hyakushaku Canon, and a labyrinthine network of stone corridors, stairs, and niches that transforms the quarried mountain into something that occupies the boundary between excavation and cathedral. The most perplexing aspect of Nokogiri is the relationship between the practical and the sacred that the site embodies. The stone cutting here served an industrial purpose. It was commercial quarrying, and yet the same hands, or closely related ones, carved devotional images of extraordinary scale and refinement into the rock faces created by the extraction process. The 16-meter reclining Buddha is not a marginal decoration. It required careful planning and sustained skilled labor. Was the sacred work a form of gratitude for the stone given up? Was the mountain itself understood as a body being offered, and the carvings a form of acknowledgement? And what does it mean that the largest Buddha on the site was deliberately buried, hidden under earth and vegetation, for portions of the Meiji period, when Buddhist institutions faced state suppression, only to be rediscovered and reclaimed? The Buddhism practiced at Nokogiri belongs to a distinctively Japanese synthesis, incorporating Shingon esoteric traditions, Pure Land devotionalism, and a deep reverence for natural landforms as inherently sacred spaces. Japanese Buddhist cosmology frequently understands mountains as mandala, three-dimensional maps of the universe, and the act of carving the Buddha into the mountain is, within this framework, not the imposition of a human image onto natural stone, but the revelation of a form already latent in the rock. The mountain was already a body. The carvers simply made its face visible. The prevailing scholarly consensus treats Nokogiri primarily as an archaeological record of pre-industrial quarrying techniques and a significant example of Japanese rock-cut Buddhist art, understanding the sacred and commercial functions as complementary rather than paradoxical. The scale of the carved figures and the spatial planning of the stone corridors is consistent with organized temple workshop traditions operating over centuries. The ritual interpretation reaches deeper. Some Buddhist commentaries on sites like Nokogiri describe them as places where the earth itself has achieved consciousness, where sustained human devotion has, over sufficient time, transformed a hill of stone into a sentient entity. Whether or not that reading is literal, its cultural consequence is real. The mountain at Nokogiri is not experienced as an object. It is experienced as a presence. Could the specific choice of a quarried space for this kind of devotional work reflect a philosophy of sacred ecology? The idea that spaces emptied by human extraction carry a particular spiritual debt, and that filling them with carved forms of compassion was understood as a kind of repayment. Was the reclining Buddha's concealment and rediscovery itself part of a longer ritual logic? A burial and resurrection embedded in stone? Who were the specific craftspeople who carved the reclining figure? And are their names anywhere in the historical record? How did the carvers manage the scale problem, creating a recognizably proportioned 16-meter figure in rock without any modern measurement tools? What guided the decision about which figures to carve and where to place them? And how many more carved spaces remain inside the mountain's interior, unexcavated? Mount Nokogiri is its own answer to the question of what a mountain is for. Not scenery, not merely a geological formation. Something that can be entered, carved, hollowed, and filled with meaning until the distinction between the natural and the made dissolves entirely. The stone corridors breathe. The great Buddha closes its eyes, and the forest grows over everything the Meiji period tried to erase. Descending Nokogiri, we turn south and west, crossing the Sea of Japan and the Eurasian interior, until we arrive at another extraordinary relationship between rock and human intention, this time in the Hyogo prefecture of Japan, where a single stone of impossible scale sits in a valley and refuses every obvious explanation. There is a rock in a valley near the town of Asago in Hyogo Prefecture, Japan, and the first thing you notice is that it is very large, and the second thing you notice is that it appears to be floating. It does not float, of course. It rests on a pedestal base of the same stone, but the geometry of its undercut sides creates a persistent optical argument with gravity. The stone is roughly rectangular. Its surface is unusually flat, and it sits in a small reservoir that reflects its mass back at you from below, so that you are always looking at two of it. The Ishino Hoden is a massive rock in Takasago City, Hyogo Prefecture, a single, partially quarried block of andesite that measures approximately 6 meters high by 7 meters wide, with an estimated weight of around 600 tons. It appears to have been cut from the adjacent bedrock using flat, precise incisions that left the base and one side attached to the parent rock, while the other faces were carved clean. The prevailing interpretation is that this was a quarry block prepared for transport, most likely during the Kofun period, 3rd to 6th centuries AD, when Japanese rulers were constructing enormous keyhole-shaped burial mounds that required precisely this kind of massive dressed stone. For reasons unknown, the block was never moved. What defeats simple explanation is the cutting. The andesite faces of Ishino Hoden are near perfectly flat enough that water sheets off them evenly, and the right-angle precision of the corners is consistent across a scale that would challenge modern quarrying equipment. The Kofun period explanation is plausible. but it raises its own questions. If this block was prepared for transport, what technology did its builders plan to use to move 600 tons of cut stone across terrain that even modern construction finds challenging? No tools have been found at the site, no ramps, no evidence of any infrastructure for the move that was apparently being planned. Who cut this stone? And what happened before they could finish the job? The Kofun period in Japan was one of extraordinary social transformation, the consolidation of clan-based polities into a centralized state, the adoption of Buddhism as a state religion, the development of writing, and the construction of the keyhole tombs, Kofun, that give the period its name. The largest of these tombs, the Daisen Kofun of Emperor Nintoku, remains the largest burial monument by area in the world. The builders who prepared Ishino Hoden were operating within a tradition of monumental construction whose ambitions were continental in scale. Archaeologists working on the Kofun period generally accept the quarry block interpretation and note that the flat surfaces and rectilinear form are consistent with known cutting techniques of the period. Stone wedges, controlled splitting, and experienced quarry teams working systematically across rock faces. The incomplete state of the extraction is not unusual. Abandoned quarry works exist across the world, and the reasons for abandonment, changes in patronage, technological limitations, political disruption, are rarely preserved in the record. Shinto tradition, however, has long venerated Ishino Hoden as a sacred object, specifically as a form of iwakura, a rock seat in which a kami, divine spirit, resides. The local shrine that surrounds the stone is dedicated to Okuninushi, a major deity of the Japanese pantheon, and the stone's apparent suspension above the water of its surrounding pool amplifies its quality of supernatural presence. Whether the sacred designation preceded or followed the quarrying is itself a fascinating question. Some researchers intrigued by the precision of the cutting and the extraordinary weight of the block have drawn comparisons to other massive ancient worked stones, the Baalbek trilithons, the unfinished obelisk at Aswan, and raised the general question of whether ancient cultures possessed collective knowledge of material handling at large scale that archaeology has not yet fully accounted for. How was the site of the cut chosen? By a surveyor, by a priest, or by both working together? If this stone was intended for a specific tomb, which ruler's burial was being prepared for? Why does the Shinto tradition that venerates the stone describe it as having arrived from elsewhere, as a stone that fell from the sky, when its geological relationship to the adjacent bedrock is clear? And is the reservation of 600 tons of rock in a small valley a form of failure or a form of preservation? Ishino Hoden sits in its reflecting pool and offers no testimony. Its surfaces are flat. Its corners are sharp. Its weight is immovable, without machinery that did not exist when it was cut. And it remains there, half-finished, fully venerated, and entirely itself. We move now from Japan's ancient stones into the Central Asian interior, to the desert frontier of ancient Khwarezm, in what is now Uzbekistan, where enormous mud-brick fortresses rise from the flatlands of a vanished irrigation civilization. There is a rock in a valley near the town of Asago in Hyogo Prefecture, Japan, and the first thing you notice is that it is very large, and the second thing you notice is that it appears to be floating. It does not float, of course. It rests on a pedestal base of the same stone, but the geometry of its undercut sides creates a persistent optical argument with gravity. The stone is roughly rectangular. Its surface is unusually flat, and it sits in a small reservoir that reflects its mass back at you from below, so that you are always looking at two of it. The Ishino-Hoden is a massive rock in Takasago City, Hyogo Prefecture, a single, partially quarried block of andesite that measures approximately 6 meters high by 7 meters wide, with an estimated weight of around 600 tons. It appears to have been cut from the adjacent bedrock using flat, precise incisions that left the base and one side attached to the parent rock, while the other faces were carved clean. The prevailing interpretation is that this was a quarry block prepared for transport, most likely during the Kofun period, 3rd to 6th centuries AD, when Japanese rulers were constructing enormous keyhole-shaped burial mounds that required precisely this kind of massive dressed stone. For reasons unknown, the block was never moved. What defeats simple explanation is the cutting. The andesite faces of Ishino-Hoden are near perfectly flat enough that water sheets off them evenly, and the right-angle precision of the corners is consistent across a scale that would challenge modern quarrying equipment. The Kofun period explanation is plausible, but it raises its own questions. If this block was prepared for transport, what technology did its builders plan to use to move 600 tons of cut stone across terrain that even modern construction finds challenging? No tools have been found at the site, no ramps, no evidence of any infrastructure for the move that was apparently being planned. Who cut this stone? And what happened before they could finish the job? The Kofun period in Japan was one of extraordinary social transformation, the consolidation of clan-based polities into a centralized state, the adoption of Buddhism as a state religion, the development of writing, and the construction of the keyhole tombs, Kofun, that give the period its name. The largest of these tombs, the Daisen Kofun of Emperor Nintoku, remains the largest burial monument by area in the world. The builders who prepared Ishino-Hoden were operating within a tradition of monumental construction whose ambitions were continental in scale. Archaeologists working on the Kofun period generally accept the quarry block interpretation and note that the flat surfaces and rectilinear form are consistent with known cutting techniques of the period: stone wedges, controlled splitting, and experienced quarry teams working systematically across rock faces. The incomplete state of the extraction is not unusual. Abandoned quarry works exist across the world, and the reasons for abandonment, changes in patronage, technological limitations, political disruption, are rarely preserved in the record. Shinto tradition, however, has long venerated Ishino-Hoden as a sacred object, specifically as a form of iwakura, a rock seat in which a kami, divine spirit, resides. The local shrine that surrounds the stone is dedicated to Okuninushi, a major deity of the Japanese pantheon, and the stone's apparent suspension above the water of its surrounding pool amplifies its quality of supernatural presence. Whether the sacred designation preceded or followed the quarrying is itself a fascinating question. Some researchers intrigued by the precision of the cutting and the extraordinary weight of the block have drawn comparisons to other massive ancient worked stones, the Baalbek trilithons, the unfinished obelisk at Aswan, and raised the general question of whether ancient cultures possessed collective knowledge of material handling at large scale that archaeology has not yet fully accounted for. How was the site of the cut chosen? By a surveyor, by a priest, or by both working together? If this stone was intended for a specific tomb, which ruler's burial was being prepared for? Why does the Shinto tradition that venerates the stone describe it as having arrived from elsewhere, as a stone that fell from the sky, when its geological relationship to the adjacent bedrock is clear? And is the reservation of 600 tons of rock in a small valley a form of failure or a form of preservation? Who commanded Ayaz Kala in its final years before the Mongol onslaught? And did they know what was coming? Are the irrigation canals that fed this civilization fundamentally unrestorable? Or does the technology for their revival still exist in the landscape? What percentage of the Khwarezmian textual and artistic record was destroyed in the 13th century, and is any of it recoverable? And when the last garrison abandoned these walls, did they believe they were leaving temporarily or forever? Ayaz Kala's mud brick walls return slowly to the earth from which they were made, a dissolution that will eventually be complete, leaving only low ridges and the pattern of the old canal shadows to suggest that something extraordinary was once organized on this plain. The desert is patient. It has already outlasted the civilization that fought it for 1,000 years. Crossing now from Central Asia's arid heartland, we descend south and west into the Ethiopian highlands, to a landscape of rolling savanna, where carved pillars mark the graves of a people whose name we know, but whose inner world remains largely beyond our reach. The Ethiopian highlands in the Sodo region of the South Nations, nationalities, and peoples region carry a quality of light that is specific to equatorial altitude: sharp, clean, slightly lavender at the edges of the afternoon. The air is cool. The grass is long. Euphorbia trees cast sparse shadows across the rolling terrain. And rising from a field near the town of Tia, with no announcement and no fence for much of their history, are rows of carved standing stones that have been here for at least 8 centuries, and possibly much longer, whose symbols have been recorded, catalogued, studied, and not yet understood. The Tia stelae are a group of approximately 36 carved standing stones near the town of Tia in southern Ethiopia, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980. The stelae range in height from less than a meter to over 3 meters, and many are decorated with incised symbols, swords, human figures reduced to abstract shapes, a motif that appears repeatedly and has been described variously as a plant, a phallus, and a stylized human form. They mark graves. Archaeological excavation has revealed burials beneath most of the decorated stones, typically containing skeletal remains of adults, sometimes multiple individuals, sometimes showing evidence of traumatic injury. They appear to date primarily from the 12th to 14th centuries AD, placing them in the context of the pre-Aksumite and early medieval period of southern Ethiopian history. The symbols are the puzzle that refuses to close. The sword motif appears frequently enough to suggest a consistent iconographic program. These may be warrior graves, markers of a martial elite. But the other symbols defy easy reading. The repeated abstracted figure, possibly human, possibly cosmic, appears in different orientations on different stones, sometimes paired with swords, sometimes alone. There is no known written key. No contemporary textual tradition from this region and period has been found that explains the symbolic vocabulary. Who developed this iconographic language? In what context was it learned and transmitted? And what did each symbol communicate to the mourners who stood before these stones? And why does the tradition of its use appear to begin and end within a relatively limited time window, leaving no obvious descendants? The people who raised the Tia stelae were likely part of the broader cluster of Cushitic and Nilotic cultures that occupied the Ethiopian highlands and Rift Valley during the medieval period. Complex agricultural and pastoral communities with sophisticated social hierarchies, regional trade networks, and ritual practices that drew on deep pre-Christian and pre-Islamic religious traditions, even as those faiths were reshaping the wider Horn of Africa. Southern Ethiopia during the 12th to 14th centuries was a zone of significant cultural dynamism. Multiple kingdoms and chiefdoms negotiating territory, identity, and belief in a landscape of considerable ecological and political complexity. Scholars working on the Tia stelae generally propose that the decorated stones functioned as elite funerary markers, visible, durable statements of status, identity, and perhaps genealogical claim. The sword imagery in this reading communicates martial identity or warrior status. The more abstract symbols may denote lineage, clan, or cosmological affiliation. Parallels with other stele traditions across the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula suggest a wider regional vocabulary of stone marking that Tia participates in but does not fully replicate. A ritual or cosmological reading of the symbols opens different possibilities. The abstracted human figure, appearing in varied orientations that may reflect positions of life and death, could represent a cosmological diagram of the soul's journey, its orientation in relation to the stone, the grave, the sky, and the earth, encoding stages of a post-mortem transition that the broader community understood and the stone was designed to facilitate. Is it possible that the stelae were not primarily markers for the living, not monuments to be read and remembered, but devices for the dead? Instruments that needed to be correctly configured in order to complete the transition of the buried person from one state of being to another. How many of the Tia stelae have fallen and been re-erected in incorrect positions, potentially scrambling whatever spatial logic the original arrangement expressed? Are there other stelae fields in the wider region that share the same symbolic vocabulary, and have they been systematically surveyed? What ended the tradition? And does any living community in the region maintain an oral memory of what these stones were for? The stelae field at Tia is quiet on most days. The wind moves through the long grass between the stones. The symbols face in different directions, maintaining whatever conversation they were designed to have with the ground, the sky, and the bodies beneath them. That conversation began in the 12th century. We have not yet found a way to listen. From the Ethiopian highlands, we travel east across the Indian Ocean and down the East African coast to the ruins of a Swahili trading port on the Tanzanian shore, where mosques and tombs and the echo of a cosmopolitan medieval civilization dissolve into the sand. The shore here is sugar white, and the palm trees grow without arrangement, tilted at angles dictated by wind and the sandy soil's unwillingness to grip. The Indian Ocean arrives in flat, warm sheets. The air is salt and vegetation, and just back from the beach, obscured now by secondary growth and the creeping encroachment of a modern suburb, the coral rag walls of medieval structures jut from the earth with the blunt insistence of things that once mattered enormously, and now must argue for attention. The Kunduchi ruins are the remains of a Swahili trading settlement on the Tanzanian coast, approximately 25 kilometers north of Dar es Salaam, dating primarily from the 14th to 17th centuries A.D. The site includes the remains of a mosque, several pillar tombs of a type characteristic of medieval Swahili funerary architecture, and evidence of domestic structures. Kunduchi participated in the Indian Ocean trade network that connected East Africa to Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. a commercial and cultural web of extraordinary vitality that moved porcelain, textiles, gold, ivory, and iron across thousands of miles of open ocean from at least the 9th century A.D. The most architecturally distinctive and intellectually perplexing elements of Kunduchi are the pillar tombs, vertical towers of coral rag limestone, sometimes decorated with embedded Chinese porcelain bowls, rising from flat grave enclosures. These structures appear across the East African coast from Somalia to Mozambique, and their specific function, marking the graves of notable individuals, possibly male elders or merchants, is generally understood. What resists easy explanation is the choice of porcelain as decorative material. The bowls embedded in the tomb pillars were often high-status Chinese export ceramics, valuable trade goods that were apparently deliberately destroyed and incorporated into mortuary architecture. Why use objects of commercial value in this way? And what did the presence of Chinese ceramic fragments on an African coastal tomb communicate to those who viewed it about the identity of the buried person, their networks, their status, their relationship to a world that extended to China? The Swahili civilization, the proper name for the coastal culture that built Kunduchi and dozens of similar settlements, is one of the most cosmopolitan in African history. The word Swahili itself derives from the Arabic for people of the coast, and the culture was genuinely hybrid from its origins. Bantu-speaking African agricultural and fishing communities in long-term contact with Arabic, Persian, and eventually Indian and Chinese traders, producing a language, a material culture, and an architectural tradition that borrowed fluidly from multiple traditions while remaining distinctly itself. Archaeologists and historians studying the Swahili coast generally interpret the pillar tombs as elite funerary markers whose embedded porcelain functioned as a form of conspicuous consumption, a display of wealth and long-distance connection, deliberately made permanent and public through its incorporation into an indestructible monument. The destruction of valuable objects as mortuary offering is a widespread practice across many cultures. Embedding them in architecture extends their communicative lifespan indefinitely. The symbolic reading extends this interpretation into the cosmological. The pillar tomb itself, rising vertically from the horizontal plane of the grave, may encode a cosmological statement about the axis between worlds, the vertical connection between the buried dead, the living community, and the sky above. In Islamic tradition, which shaped Swahili practice from the 9th century onward, the grave is a threshold, not a terminus, and the architecture above it may be understood as a kind of permanent prayer in stone, oriented toward Mecca, expressing the buried person's continued participation in the community of believers. Some researchers have noted that the spatial organization of certain Swahili coastal sites, the relationship between mosque, tomb, and residential area, reflects a cosmological urbanism in which sacred space structures, social space, and the entire town is, in effect, a three-dimensional expression of an Islamic cosmological diagram. Kunduchi, even in its ruined state, preserves traces of this spatial logic. What percentage of the Kunduchi site remains unexcavated, and what material evidence of Indian Ocean trade networks lies beneath the encroaching suburb? Are the Chinese porcelain fragments recovered from the pillar tombs specific enough in their origin and dating to map the precise trade relationships of the individuals buried here? And what became of the community? Where did they go, and when, and why did they not return to maintain the site? Kunduchi, is being swallowed by the city that has grown around it, and the coral rag walls are losing the argument with time. What was once a node in a global trade network is now a marginal space between a beach resort and a residential neighborhood. And the distance between those two descriptions of the same place is the full measure of what the modern world has not yet learned to value. Leaving the warm Tanzanian coast, we cross the South Atlantic and enter the Amazon basin's ancient past, traveling to the rock shelters of Monte Alegre in the Brazilian state of Pará, where painted hands and animals on cave walls may force a revision of the entire human story of the Americas. The Amazon floodplain in the state of Pará is not a single thing. Near Monte Alegre, the river country gives way to low hills, an anomaly in the flatness, and on these hills, in sandstone outcroppings that glow orange in late afternoon light, there are shallow rock shelters formed by millennia of wind and water erosion. The forest presses close. The humidity is absolute. The rock walls under the overhangs are painted, ochre and red and black, animals and geometric forms and hands, dozens of hands, and some of these paintings may be older than anything comparable in North America by several thousand years. The Monte Alegre rock shelters, located in the Caverna de Pedra Pintada and surrounding sites in Pará State, Brazil, contain some of the oldest confirmed rock art in the Americas. Excavations led by archaeologist Anna Roosevelt in the 1990s produced radiocarbon dates, placing occupation of the shelters at approximately 11,000 years ago, contemporaneous with, and possibly preceding, the Clovis culture that was then considered the first human presence in the Americas. The implications were, and remain, profound. The Amazon basin, long dismissed as too environmentally challenging to have supported early human settlement, appears to have been populated by sophisticated hunter-gatherers whose artistic tradition was already mature at a date that demands a reconsideration of how and when the Americas were first peopled. The central puzzle is not simply the age of the rock art, but its nature. The Pedra Pintada paintings include geometric forms, animal figures, particularly fish and other river fauna, and handprints, all executed with evident technique. The people who made these images had not recently arrived in an unfamiliar landscape. Their art shows an intimate, specific knowledge of the Amazon environment, suggesting generations of accumulated ecological understanding rather than the work of the continent's very first arrivals. Were these communities, then, descended from an even earlier wave of migration than the Clovis-era population that archaeology had previously placed at the beginning of American prehistory? And if so, where did that earlier migration come from? And what route did it take? The Monte Alegre people, their precise cultural identity remains unnamed by any tradition, were Paleo-Indian hunter-gatherers occupying a riverine floodplain environment at the edge of the last glacial maximum's climatic chaos. They fished the Amazon's early tributaries, gathered forest resources, and painted on rock. That they were painting at all, at this date, in this place, is a statement about the depth and continuity of human symbolic behavior that undermines any model of cultural evolution that treats art as a late and specialized achievement. The mainstream scholarly response to Anna Roosevelt's Monte Alegre findings, initially skeptical, has been increasingly accommodating as further dating evidence and additional pre-Clovis sites across the Americas have accumulated. The current consensus acknowledges that the Americas were peopled earlier and more complexly than a single Clovis-era migration model allows, and that the Amazon basin's role in this story is substantially underestimated due to poor preservation conditions for organic materials in tropical climates. A symbolic reading of the Monte Alegre paintings emphasizes their consistent focus on boundary spaces, rock shelters at the edge of water, the transitional zone between the terrestrial and aquatic worlds, the overhang that mediates between open sky and enclosed earth. In many Amazonian traditions, these threshold environments are understood as places of heightened spiritual attention, where the different layers of the cosmos are closest to one another. The hands on the walls are not merely signatures, they are acts of contact. The human palm pressed against the surface that separates the visible from the invisible. Could the specific locations chosen for painting at Monte Alegre reflect an acoustic property of the shelters, the way certain shapes of rock produce resonance or echo rather than purely visual criteria? Several researchers studying prehistoric rock art worldwide have noted that painted surfaces frequently correspond to sites of unusual sonic behavior within cave environments. How many other painted shelters exist in the Monte Alegre hills that have not yet been surveyed? What happened to the lineage of people who painted these walls? Did they become ancestors of later Amazonian cultures, or were they a separate population that left no surviving descendants? And what did it mean to the person who pressed their hand to this wall 11,000 years ago, to leave a mark? The handprints at Monte Alegre are the oldest conversation starter in the Americas. They were not addressed to us, they couldn't have been, but here we are, on the receiving end of an act of communication that waited 11,000 years for an audience. That alone deserves a long silence. From the Amazon's ancient rock shelters, we now travel north to the lower Mississippi Valley in Louisiana, to a place where Earth itself was shaped into something extraordinary, long before any European eye reached the Americas. The lower Mississippi Valley in late summer is green past reason, a dense, mosquito-attended green that presses in on all sides, the bayous moving with the languid certainty of water that has nowhere urgent to go. The land here is old flood country, flat and alluvial, built from the sediment of a continent washed down over millions of years. And in this flatness, in what is now West Carroll Parish, Louisiana, a group of people who have left no name for themselves and no descendant tradition that acknowledges them directly built, over generations, one of the largest and most precisely engineered earthwork complexes in the ancient world. Poverty Point is a monumental earthworks site in northeastern Louisiana, dating from approximately 1700 to 1100 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with the Late Bronze Age in Europe and the New Kingdom of Egypt. The site comprises a series of 6 large concentric ridges arranged in a partial oval, each ridge originally standing about 2 meters high and several meters wide, forming an artificial amphitheater-like arrangement approximately 1.2 kilometers in diameter. At the western edge of the ridges, a massive mound, Mound A, rises 11 meters from the surrounding terrain and is shaped, when viewed from above, roughly like a bird in flight. The site also includes several other mounds of varying size and alignment. The central enigma of Poverty Point is simultaneously organizational and cultural. The population of the Americas in 1700 BCE did not, by any previously held model, possess the social infrastructure required to plan, manage, and execute earthwork construction at this scale. Poverty Point's builders were archaic period hunter-gatherers. They had no confirmed agriculture, no permanent villages in the usual archaeological sense, and no writing system. Yet, the concentric ridges display a geometric precision. Their curvature and spacing are consistent enough to suggest systematic measurement across a distance of more than a kilometer. That implies organized labor, centralized planning, and, almost certainly, a design conceived in advance of construction. How did a non-agricultural society mobilize the human energy required to move an estimated 400,000 cubic meters of earth? And what was this extraordinary geometry for? The Poverty Point culture represents an archaic period society of the lower Mississippi Valley that had developed a trade network of remarkable reach. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, galena from Missouri, and steatite from the Appalachians have all been recovered from the site, suggesting connections across a geographic radius of over 1,000 kilometers. The people who assembled here were not isolated. They were the hub of a continental exchange system, and the site itself may have functioned in part as a gathering place for this network, a marketplace, a ceremonial center, or both simultaneously. The prevailing academic interpretation of Poverty Point treats it as a ceremonial and social aggregation site, a place where dispersed hunter-gatherer populations gathered periodically for exchange, ritual, and the maintenance of social networks. The earthwork ridges in this reading may have supported residential structures during gathering events, and the mounds served ceremonial functions consistent with a broadly shared North American tradition of mound building as an expression of cosmological belief. The bird-shaped plan of Mound A connects directly to cosmological traditions widespread across the ancient Americas. The bird as mediator between the sky world and the earth, the shape of flight as a sacred geometry. If the mound was deliberately shaped as a bird in flight, the act of building it was itself an act of cosmological inscription, pressing the shape of a divine messenger into the earth as a form of prayer made permanent. Some researchers have noted that the curvature of Poverty Point's concentric ridges, if extended to a full circle, would produce a diameter consistent with alignments to major lunar standstill positions, suggesting that the site's geometry may be as much a calendrical or astronomical instrument as a residential or ceremonial one. What happened to the Poverty Point culture? Why does the site appear to have been largely abandoned by approximately 1000 BCE, before the full development of the Mississippian mound-building traditions that followed? Do the trade goods at the site represent the exchange of physical materials or the movement of ideas, technologies, rituals, cosmologies that the physical objects were merely the vehicles for? And what does it mean for our understanding of human social complexity that a society without agriculture built something this large, this precisely planned, this cosmologically intentional? Poverty Point sits in the Louisiana bottomlands and waits, as all earthworks wait, for the erosion that will eventually flatten it, and for the understanding that has not yet arrived. The ridges are still there. Although centuries of agriculture have smoothed them, the bird still flies. And the 400,000 cubic meters of earth that someone moved by hand across generations is still exactly where they put it. Crossing now from the lower Mississippi to the island of Britain, we travel backward and forward in time simultaneously, arriving at one of the most powerfully defended hill forts in prehistoric Europe, on a ridge in the south of England where the evidence of ancient violence is literally written in the landscape. The Dorset downland in winter is stripped back to essentials: the chalk pale under thin grass, the sky enormous and gray, the wind from the southwest carrying the smell of the channel 15 miles away. Maiden Castle rises from this landscape, not as a peak, but as a presence, a long, oval hilltop whose multiple concentric ramparts, still standing meters high after 2,000 years, transform the natural ridge into something so clearly deliberate that you feel the intention before you understand the architecture. From the air, the earthworks look like the plans of a city drawn in the chalk. From the ground, they feel like a demonstration of what a determined community can do with earth and time. Maiden Castle is the largest hill fort in Britain, situated near Dorchester in Dorset, and among the most complex Iron Age earthwork fortifications in all of Europe. The hill was first occupied in the Neolithic period. A long barrow on the eastern summit dates to approximately 3,500 BCE, but the hill fort itself was developed and expanded during the Iron Age from around 600 BCE, reaching its greatest extent by approximately 450 BCE, when the multiple rampart systems were constructed. The site's perimeter runs to approximately 1.8 kilometers, and at its greatest extent, the interior covers nearly 18 hectares. The entrance systems, staggered overlapping gateways at the eastern and western ends, are masterpieces of defensive engineering, designed to channel attackers into killing grounds while defenders held the high ground above. The deepest mystery at Maiden Castle is not the engineering, but the catastrophe. In approximately 43 CE, the Roman general Vespasian, later emperor, brought the Second Augustan Legion through the southwest of Britain in a campaign of rapid conquest. At Maiden Castle, that campaign left its mark in the ground. Excavations by Mortimer Wheeler in the 1930s uncovered a war cemetery at the site's eastern gateway, containing the remains of approximately 38 individuals bearing the marks of violent death. Skulls cloven by heavy blows, a Roman ballista bolt embedded in a vertebra, wounds consistent with combat at close range. These were the defenders of Maiden Castle, interred hastily where they fell or nearby, the evidence of a defeat that ended a way of life. Why did the inhabitants of Maiden Castle resist when so many other Iron Age communities accommodated the Roman advance? And what does the meticulous care of that war cemetery, the bodies buried with food offerings, with personal objects, tell us about how the survivors processed a loss of this magnitude? The Durotriges, the Iron Age tribe who occupied Maiden Castle and the surrounding Dorset territory, were farmers, craftspeople, and traders who had been developing this hill fort community for nearly 500 years by the time Roman legions appeared on the chalk ridges. Their material culture shows sophistication, wheel-thrown pottery, evidence of ironworking, grain storage pits that imply surplus management and a complex local economy. The decision to occupy and defend Maiden Castle was not simply pragmatic. It was also a statement of communal identity. The hill fort was not just a refuge, but the physical expression of who the Durotriges were. Mainstream archaeology treats the Maiden Castle War Cemetery as straightforward evidence of violent Roman conquest, consistent with Suetonius's account of Vespasian reducing more than 20 hill forts in the southwest, and with the broader pattern of Roman military advance through resistant communities. The ballista bolt in the spine is perhaps the most precisely dated moment in all of British prehistory. A specific Tuesday morning in 43 or 44 CE, when a Roman artillery crew made a shot that killed a specific person. The symbolic dimension runs beneath the military one. The Durotriges' decision to hold Maiden Castle knowing the military odds, may have been as much a ritual as a strategic choice, a commitment to dying on the land that constituted their identity, rather than surviving on land that would belong to strangers. The war cemetery's grave goods, joints of lamb, ceramic vessels, objects of personal significance, suggest that the survivors understood these deaths as honorable and the buried as continuing presences rather than lost members. Some researchers have noted that Maiden Castle's Neolithic long barrow predates the hill fort by 3,000 years, and that the Iron Age community's choice to build their fortress around this ancient burial monument, incorporating it into the defensive perimeter, may have been a deliberate statement about continuity, about the right of possession established through ancestral connection to the deep past of the landscape. How many of the individuals in the war cemetery were women or children? And what does that suggest about who was fighting at the Eastern Gateway? What survived of Durotrige's material culture after the Roman conquest? What was absorbed? What was suppressed? What went underground? And who were the specific survivors who buried their dead with such care and then walked down from the chalk ridge into a world that had fundamentally changed overnight? Maiden Castle stands on its chalk ridge in the Dorset Downland, and the ramparts are still there, still legible, still expressing something about human determination that 2,000 years of weather has not erased. The gate systems still funnel your path as you walk through them. The geography of resistance, it turns out, is very durable. Leaving England's chalk hills, we cross the English Channel and move north along the French Atlantic coast to Brittany, where a cairn of extraordinary age sits above the sea and forces a reconsideration of everything we think we know about the Neolithic mind. Brittany in spring smells of gorse and salt. The coastline near Ploézoc, on the Kernelihan Peninsula above the Bay of Morlaix, is where the land makes its final arguments before giving way to the Atlantic. Rocky headlands, low shrub, the sea gunmetal or turquoise depending on the cloud cover overhead. On a promontory here, overlooking water on 3 sides, a massive stone structure rises from the peninsular ridge. A stepped cairn of dry stone construction, roughly 70 meters long and 20 meters wide, built from 2 kinds of stone in 2 distinct phases, containing 11 passage chambers that point inward like spokes to a hub that exists only as the intention that organized them. The Barnenez Cairn near Ploézoc in northern Finistère, Brittany, is one of the oldest megalithic monuments in the world, with its earliest construction phase dated to approximately 4,850 BCE, making it older than the pyramids of Giza by roughly 2,000 years, older than Stonehenge, and among the most ancient monumental architectures surviving anywhere on Earth. The cairn contains 11 separate passage tombs, each with a corbelled chamber at the end of a stone-lined corridor, some of the chambers still largely intact and preserving the original dry stone construction. It was built in 2 phases by communities of the Atlantic Neolithic, the earliest phase in dolerite, the second in granite, suggesting sustained use and active expansion over perhaps 3 or 4 generations. The puzzle at Barnenez operates at multiple levels. The structural engineering of the corbelled chambers, stones placed in concentric, ever inward-leaning rings until they close at the top, requires both planning and a sophisticated empirical understanding of weight distribution. This technique appears at Barnenez in approximately 4,850 BCE, centuries before it appears at comparable monuments elsewhere. But the deeper puzzle is social. The construction of Barnenez required the quarrying, transport, and precise placement of an estimated 14,000 tons of stone. For communities of the early Neolithic Atlantic coast, small, dispersed farming and fishing groups with no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no writing system, the logistics of this project remain genuinely difficult to account for within the available social and technological frameworks. What drove communities at this specific moment in Atlantic prehistory to begin building at this scale? And what does the monument's orientation, its chambers opening primarily to the south and east, toward the winter and spring sunrise, reveal about the cosmological problem these builders were trying to solve? The Atlantic Neolithic cultures of Brittany were among the first agricultural communities in northwestern Europe, adapting cereal farming and animal husbandry adopted from the east, while maintaining significant elements of Mesolithic maritime subsistence. Their ideological world, insofar as we can read it from monuments alone, was organized around the ancestors. The management of ancestral remains, the performance of periodic ceremonies that renewed the relationship between the living and the dead, and the inscription of cosmological knowledge into the landscape through monument building that oriented communities in space and time. Archaeologists broadly interpret the Barnenez cairn as a communal tomb and ritual center, a place where the dead were processed, possibly periodically revisited and rearranged, and where ceremonies maintained the ancestral connection that gave the community its identity and its relationship to the land. The monument's visual prominence on its peninsular ridge, visible from the sea and from the surrounding countryside, communicated territorial claim and social continuity in ways that a living human community could not. The symbolic reading goes to the design of the passage tombs themselves. The act of entering a passage tomb is a full-body experience of liminality. The living person moves from light into darkness along a narrowing stone corridor, arriving, finally, in a sealed chamber with the dead. In many interpretations, this architecture was not merely spatial, but soteriological, a rehearsal of death and return, a controlled experience of the threshold that the dead had crossed. The corbelled ceiling, closing overhead, represents the earth itself pressing down. The presence of light at the solstice, entering the chamber through the precisely oriented passage, was a reminder that the boundary was permeable. There are researchers who have noted that the acoustic properties of Barnenez's chambers, specifically the resonant qualities of the corbelled space, which amplifies and transforms sound in specific ways, may have been intentional rather than incidental to the design, turning the tomb interior into an instrument for altered states of consciousness during ritual use. Why were the two construction phases executed in different stone? Was this a practical decision or a theological one? How many generations of dead are contained within the 11 chambers? And can osteological analysis reconstruct the social composition of the community that used this monument? And when the last ceremony was performed here, sometime in the 3rd or 4th millennium BCE, did the participants know it was the last? Did they have a word for ending, or only for return? The Barnenez cairn has survived 5,500 years of Atlantic weather, a period of use as a quarry in the 20th century that removed significant sections of its exterior face, and several decades of partial restoration that have stabilized what remains. It is not intact, but what survives is more than enough to make you stand on the peninsula and feel the full weight of the question about what kind of mind looks at a coastal headland and decides to carry 14,000 tons of stone onto it. not for protection, not for practical use of any kind, for meaning. From the Breton headlands, we sail south into the Mediterranean and then turn west toward Sardinia, the large, ancient, and still imperfectly understood island where a civilization built thousands of stone towers that have no exact parallel anywhere else. Sardinia from above is brown and olive-green in summer, the maquis covering the low hills, the limestone ridges white against the vegetation, the interior plateau baked flat by months of heat. From an aircraft, the towers are visible across the whole of the island, truncated cones of fitted stone, rising from promontories and hillsides and plain alike, between 7,000 and 9,000 of them still standing in various states of preservation. You see one, and then you see another, and then you realize the entire landscape is punctuated by these structures, that whatever people built them were not tentative about it. The Nuraga is the defining architectural achievement of the Nuragic civilization, which flourished on Sardinia from approximately 1800 to 238 BCE, when Roman conquest ended its independence. A nuraga is a round or multi-lobed tower of dry stone construction, built without mortar, using locally quarried basalt or limestone blocks that in the largest examples weigh several tons. The towers have corbelled internal chambers accessible by internal staircases, sometimes rising to 2 or 3 stories, and the largest examples, such as Su Nuraxi at Barumini and Nuraga Santu Antin near Torralba, are surrounded by complex compounds of additional towers, courtyards, and village structures. With between 7,000 and 9,000 examples across the island, Sardinia has the highest concentration of prehistoric stone towers anywhere in the world. What makes the Nuraga tradition genuinely perplexing is precisely this density. Building a single nurag, planning, quarrying, and fitting thousands of carefully shaped stones into a self-supporting corbelled structure represents a substantial investment of time, labor, and technical skill. Doing it 7,000 times across a small island with a limited prehistoric population suggests a society in which nuraga construction was not an occasional ceremonial act, but a continuous, generationally sustained cultural program. What were all these towers for? The variety of locations, coastal promontories, inland ridges, valley floors, mountain slopes, defeats any single functional explanation. They cannot all have been defensive or ceremonial or residential or territorial markers, though all of those functions have been proposed and all may be partially correct. The Nuragic people of Sardinia are archaeologically extraordinary, a Bronze Age island culture that maintained independence and developed a sophisticated bronze casting tradition, producing the remarkable collection of small figurines known as bronzetti, warriors, priests, boxers, animals, ships, that constitute one of the most expressive sculptural traditions of the ancient Mediterranean. They traded extensively, absorbed influences from Mycenaean Greece and the Phoenician world, and built their towers for 1,500 years without apparently losing interest in the project. Mainstream scholarship proposes that nuraga towers served a complex of overlapping functions depending on context. Elite residential fortresses for local chieftains, communal granaries, territorial markers of clan or village land claims, ceremonial structures associated with water cults, given the frequent location of sacred wells near nuraga complexes, and defensive installations capable of rapid communication across the island's terrain. The social organization implied is one of competing but interconnected village communities, each asserting identity and claim through the distinctive architecture of its local nuraga. The sacred dimension of the nuraga tradition is confirmed by the associated well temples, circular subterranean chambers accessed by stone stairs, aligned to allow a pillar of sunlight to strike the water at specific astronomical moments, suggesting that water was understood as a divine medium and the wells as access points to an underworld of sacred presence. The relationship between the tower above ground and the well below it may encode a cosmological duality: sky and underworld, sun and water, the vertical axis of the human world mediated through architecture. Some researchers working on neuragic spatial organization have noted that certain nuraga sites appear to be positioned in intervisibility networks, each tower visible from its neighbors, that could have functioned as rapid communication systems across the island. If this is correct, the distribution of nuraga may represent not just a cultural tradition, but a designed infrastructure, a stone internet built over centuries, connecting a distributed population through sight lines. How did the decision to build a nuraga get made? By a chief, a council, a priest? What was the experience of the people who lived inside these towers, claustrophobic in their corbelled chambers, or safe or sacred? And what happened to the neuragic intellectual and spiritual tradition when Roman administrators arrived in 238 BCE? Was it suppressed, adapted, or simply forgotten through assimilation? The nuraga stand across Sardinia in their thousands, unmoved by the millennia, wearing their fitted stone surfaces with the authority of structures that understood their own permanence from the first stone laid. The island is dense with them. 7,000 arguments for the necessity of the tower, pressed into the Mediterranean landscape by a people who apparently could not imagine a world without one. Crossing the Mediterranean once more, we travel east into the Indian subcontinent, to the plains of Madhya Pradesh, where a Buddhist monument of extraordinary sophistication expresses a cosmological vision in carved stone that has survived 2,000 years with its meaning largely intact. The plain spreads south from the Vindhya Hills in Madhya Pradesh, dry and wide, the acacia and teak pressing close along the road that climbs to the sandstone ridge at Sanchi. At the top of the ridge, within a walled compound that has been a place of active religion for 2,300 years, the great stupa stands, a smooth stone dome the color of old bone, 46 meters in diameter and 16 meters high at the crown, surrounded by 4 ceremonial gateways carved with a density of narrative sculpture that could occupy a serious eye for weeks without exhaustion. This is not a ruin. It is a complete cosmological statement, still standing, still intelligible, waiting for anyone with the patience to read it. The Sanchi Stupa in Madhya Pradesh, India, is one of the oldest stone structures in the Indian subcontinent and one of the best preserved examples of early Buddhist architecture in the world. The core of the great stupa was originally constructed in the 3rd century BCE under the patronage of Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya dynasty, who famously converted to Buddhism and made it a state religion following the carnage of the Kalinga War. The stupa was enlarged and encased in stone during the Shunga period, and the magnificent Toranas, elaborately carved gateways at the 4 cardinal directions, were added during the 1st century BCE under the Satavahana dynasty. The site continued in active use through the medieval period, and its extensive remains include multiple smaller stupas, temples, monasteries, and pillar inscriptions. The puzzle at Sanchi is not one of unexplained origin, but of interpretive depth. The carvings on the four Taranas are among the most complex narrative programs in ancient art anywhere in the world. They depict episodes from the Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, historical events from the early Buddhist community, cosmological diagrams, scenes from daily life, and symbolic arrangements of animals, vegetation, and celestial beings whose full significance has not been exhausted by any single interpretive framework. Notably, and this is one of the Sanchi carving's most discussed features, the historical Buddha himself never appears as a human figure in the earliest layer of the sculpture program. His presence is indicated by symbols: a footprint, an umbrella, a throne, a Bodhi tree, a wheel of Dharma. What was the theological and perceptual logic behind this deliberate aniconic tradition? And what does the eventual abandonment of aniconism, the later introduction of the Buddha as a human figure, tell us about the evolution of Buddhist visual theology? Buddhism in the Ashokan period was an intellectually vigorous and theologically sophisticated tradition, just emerging from its founding generation. The historical Buddha had died approximately 2 centuries before Ashoka's reign, and the community was already engaged in the doctrinal debates that would eventually produce the Theravada, Mahayana, and other schools. The decision to build at Sanchi, on a ridge visible from the trade routes of the Malwa Plateau, near Ashoka's own birthplace, was both strategic and devotional, and the site functioned simultaneously as pilgrimage destination, educational center, and political statement about the new Buddhist empire's relationship to the Dharma. Art historians and Buddhist scholars broadly interpret the aniconic tradition at Sanchi as theologically motivated. The Buddha, having achieved nirvana and thus escaped the cycle of rebirth, cannot be represented in the forms of embodied existence. His presence is indicated by traces, footprints, the tree under which he sat, the wheel he set turning, in the same way that a great teacher's influence persists after the teacher is gone. The narrative sculptures of the Jataka tales serve as visual sutras, teachings accessible to the illiterate majority of devotees who could not read the texts. A more experiential reading focuses on the effect of circumambulating the great stupa, walking the Pradakshina path clockwise around the dome while reading the Tarana carvings. This movement enacts the stupa's cosmological function. The dome represents the world mountain, and the practitioner's circumambulation is a microcosmic performance of the cosmos's movement around its axis. Walking around the stupa is, in this sense, identical to the cosmos moving. Some researchers studying the astronomical orientations of the Sanchi complex have noted that the 4 Taranas' cardinal positioning creates a precise cosmological diagram, aligning the site with the Buddhist concept of the 4 directions and the 4 cosmic guardians, and that certain shadow events produced by the stupa on key dates in the Buddhist calendar may have been deliberately engineered. Who were the unnamed craftspeople who executed the Tarana carvings, working in a tradition that required not only technical skill, but deep doctrinal knowledge? How many individual narratives are encoded in the sculpture program that have not yet been identified and interpreted? And when the last resident monk departed Sanchi in the 13th century, as the center of Buddhist practice shifted away from this plateau, what was the last ritual performed here before the forest reclaimed the site for the next 6 centuries? Sanchi is a monument that has never entirely lost its audience. It drew pilgrims for 1,000 years, went silent, and then came back to scholarly, and spiritual attention in the 19th century without losing the quality of a living place. The Great Dome holds the sky above the Madhya Pradesh plain, and the Toranas face their four directions with the patience of structures that have been giving the same cosmological lecture for 2,000 years to anyone willing to walk around them slowly enough. From the Buddhist heartland of India, we travel west to the Iberian Peninsula, to the ruined Roman city of Coimbra in Portugal, where the most complex mosaic floors in the Western Roman world lie beneath open sky, partially flooded by the same water systems that once sustained them. The Portuguese interior in the Beira Litoral is gentle landscape, rolling hills, cork oak, the smell of cistus on warm afternoons. The road to Coimbra passes through agricultural country that has been farmed in some form since before the Roman period, and nothing in the approach quite prepares you for what the excavations reveal. Floor after floor of intricate geometric and figurative mosaic, the tesserae still bright in places, water channels running through the exposed house footprints in a gridded townscape that communicates its former ambition with the directness of the very beautiful and the very ruined. Coimbra is the largest and best preserved Roman archaeological site in Portugal, located approximately 16 kilometers south of Coimbra in the Beira littoral region. Human occupation of the site predates Roman arrival. The name Coimbra is pre-Roman, likely Celtic or pre-Celtic in origin, and the Iron Age settlement was absorbed and transformed by Roman administration from around the 1st century BCE. The city reached its greatest prosperity in the 2nd century CE, when wealthy residents funded the construction of the elaborate townhouses whose mosaic floors are now the site's principal visual achievement. The late 3rd century brought catastrophe. Coimbra was attacked and partially destroyed by raiding Suevic peoples, and its population was forcibly relocated to the newly established town of Eminium, modern Coimbra, leaving Coimbra to be slowly consumed by the agricultural landscape around it. The mosaic floors are not simply decorative. The most complex examples at Coimbra, particularly in the House of the Fountains and the House of Canterbury, include mythological narratives, Perseus and Medusa, the labors of Hercules, marine Thiassos scenes, geometric programs of extraordinary intricacy, and botanical and animal borders that serve as frames for central narrative panels. The level of craft required to produce these floors implies workshop traditions of high specialization, master designers who created cartoons, skilled tesserae setters who executed them, and patrons who understood and selected from a complex visual vocabulary. What is striking is not that Roman provincial elites commissioned such floors, that is well documented, but that these particular floors, in a provincial city on the far western edge of the empire, rival the finest examples from Rome and Carthage. Why did the wealthy residents of this relatively modest Lusitanian town invest so heavily in floor art? And what were they communicating? To guests, to rivals, to whatever gods watched from below the earth? Roman Coimbra occupied a position in the provincial hierarchy of Lusitania, the Roman province covering modern Portugal and parts of western Spain. That was substantial but not dominant, an administrative center with forum, temples, baths, and an aqueduct system of considerable engineering quality, but not a major colonial capital. The families who commissioned the great mosaic houses were local aristocrats of mixed Roman and indigenous Lusitanian ancestry, navigating the social politics of empire with the standard tools of visible wealth and cultural literacy. Historians of Roman provincial society generally interpret Conimbriga's exceptional mosaic program as an expression of cultural aspiration. The demonstration, through expensive Mediterranean craft traditions, of belonging to the broader Roman cultural conversation, despite geographical distance from the center. The mythological programs in this reading are calling cards, proof that the patron knew the stories, could afford the best artisans, and understood the visual grammar of the educated Roman world. The symbolic dimension opens when you sit with the mythological subjects themselves. Perseus and Medusa, the hero who wins by looking at the monster indirectly, who uses a mirror rather than a direct gaze, is not a casual decorative choice in a room designed for entertaining guests. The combat with Medusa is a story about the power of mediation, of knowing when to look away. Floor mosaics, walked upon rather than hung and admired, occupy an interesting position in this symbolic logic. They are images designed to be partially obscured, seen between moving feet, glimpsed rather than studied. Perhaps the mythology of the indirect gaze was appropriate precisely for an art form experienced obliquely. Some archaeological work at Conimbriga has noted that the hydraulic infrastructure, the ornamental fountains, the channel systems that ran through the House of the Fountains rooms, was considerably more sophisticated than purely functional water management required, suggesting that the presence and movement of water through the living space carried symbolic weight beyond comfort and display. How did the craftspeople who made the Conimbriga mosaics travel, workshop by workshop across the provinces, following commissions? Where were they trained? What happened to the tools and cartoons of the mosaic tradition when the Western Roman economy collapsed in the 5th century? Were they preserved, transmitted, or simply lost with the workshops? And when the last family locked the door of the House of the Fountains and walked toward Eminium, what remained in the rooms they left behind? Conimbriga's mosaics are extraordinary survivals. Made to be walked on, they have instead been protected by the earth that covered them, and they now communicate across 17 centuries with a clarity that most art of their period cannot match. The fountains no longer run, but the floors still hold the water's memory in their tesserae, blue on white, wave after wave, permanent. Leaving Portugal's ruins, we cross the Mediterranean once more and travel to the Libyan coast, to one of the greatest Roman cities ever built, a place so large and so well preserved that walking its streets still feels like inhabiting the empire, rather than examining its remains. The Libyan coast east of Tripoli receives the light from the Mediterranean at an angle that has been flattening shadows and sharpening edges since the city was founded. The sandstone columns of the colonnaded streets glow amber in the afternoon. The marble of the Severan Forum catches the sun on its carved surfaces and throws it back at you with an authority that 2,000 years of sand and salt have not entirely extinguished. The sea is blue, the ruin is enormous, and the scale of what was built here by a city that is not Rome or Carthage or Alexandria, but aspired to compete with all three simultaneously, is genuinely breathtaking. Leptis Magna, located on the Libyan coast approximately 130 kilometers east of Tripoli, is one of the best preserved Roman cities in the world. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, whose standing remains include a theater, an amphitheater, a circus, a forum complex, an exceptional colonnaded street, a market building of original design, a lighthouse, and harbor facilities on a scale that rivaled the major ports of the Western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenician traders from Carthage in approximately the 7th century BCE, Leptis became a prosperous Roman provincial city under the early empire, and reached its absolute architectural zenith under the Emperor Septimius Severus, who was born here during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE. The Severan building program transformed Leptis into an imperial showcase, and the marble brought to this Libyan coast from quarries in Greece, Egypt, and Anatolia remains one of the most extraordinary material investments in Roman provincial history. The central puzzle of Leptis Magna is a question of erasure. This was one of the largest, wealthiest, and most architecturally ambitious cities in the Roman world, a city whose native son became emperor and transformed it into a monument to his own origins. And yet, Leptis was sufficiently buried by sand and forgotten by the European scholarly tradition that when the French consul Claude Lemaire visited in 1686, he described the site as an unknown ruin whose scale he could barely comprehend. How does a city of this magnitude become so completely lost to historical memory? And what does Leptis Magna's near-total disappearance from the Western record tell us about which histories get preserved and which get covered by sand? The Punic city of Leptis preceded its Roman incarnation by several centuries, and the Punic commercial culture that built the original settlement was one of the most sophisticated mercantile civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean. Inheritors of the Phoenician seafaring tradition, managers of trade networks that connected the North African coast to the Near East, Iberia, and the Atlantic world beyond. The Romanization of Leptis was a process rather than an event, and for centuries the city maintained distinctly African characteristics alongside its Roman infrastructure. Punic inscriptions alongside Latin ones, local religious traditions coexisting with the imperial cult. Classicists and archaeologists broadly interpret Leptis Magna's extraordinary investment in Severan-era building as an expression of imperial identity politics. Septimius Severus, the first African-born Roman emperor, used his home city as a physical argument for the proposition that the empire was genuinely universal, that Rome was not a geographic location, but a cultural and political project that could be embodied anywhere the will and resources existed. The marble colonnades of the Severan Forum were, in this reading, ideology in stone. The symbolic reading of Leptis adds another dimension. The Severan architectural program deliberately quoted Roman precedent. The Arch of Septimius Severus, the Forum design, while incorporating distinctly African decorative programs, including hunting scenes, exotic animals, and iconographic references to the North African divine tradition. This was not imitation, but synthesis, a visual argument that the categories of Roman and African were not mutually exclusive, but mutually constitutive. Some researchers studying the original urban planning of Leptis have noted that the Punic street grid, which underlies the Roman city, was oriented according to astronomical principles consistent with Punic and Semitic sacred architecture, suggesting that the cosmological structure of the city predated its Roman transformation by centuries and shaped the placement of the later Severan monuments. How many unreported artifacts were removed from Leptis Magna during the early modern period, when European collectors and diplomats treated the site as a quarry for decorative marble? What does the material evidence of everyday life at Leptis, the shops, the harbor warehouses, the domestic quarters behind the colonnaded streets, tell us about the actual economic activity of the city as opposed to the monumental face it presented? And what is buried under the unexcavated portions of the site, which remain considerably larger than what has been exposed? Leptis Magna is a city of argument. The argument that ambition is worth marble, that a provincial origin is no disqualification for imperial grandeur, that a culture can be both African and Roman without contradiction. The sand that buried it also preserved it, and the archaeology that has uncovered it has returned, piece by piece, a city that understood itself as the equal of Rome. Whether Rome agreed, or whether that question was ever resolved, is one of the softer mysteries of the site, the kind that leaves you sitting on a fallen column in the afternoon light, watching the sea. We cross now from North Africa to the Middle East, to a fortress on a rock plateau above the Dead Sea that became the site of one of the most famous and most debated last stands in ancient history. The Dead Sea lies below sea level, and from the western shore, the light comes back off the water's surface as something between white and silver, almost painful. The plateau of Masada rises from the surrounding desert on three sides as a near-vertical cliff of pale yellow rock, 440 meters above the Judean desert floor. From the top, you can see Jordan. You can see Herod's ambition, pressed into the stone of a palace that cantilevers off the northern cliff face. And you can see, if you know where to look, the siege ramp that the 10th Roman legion built over a period of months in 73 CE, still there, still partly intact, a surviving argument from a military campaign that ended in a silence no one who entered the fortress subsequently broke for several years. Masada is a natural mesa in the Judean desert, overlooking the Dead Sea near the modern Israeli city of Arad, and it carries one of the most complex histories of any archaeological site in the Near East. Herod the Great built two palaces here between approximately 37 and 31 BCE, along with extensive storehouses, cisterns capable of holding millions of liters of water, bathhouses, and a complete fortification system. The site became the last stronghold of a group of Jewish rebels known as the Sicarii at the end of the First Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 73 CE. And, according to the account of the historian Josephus, when the Roman legion breached the fortress, they found the approximately 960 defenders dead by their own hands rather than submit to slavery. This account, Josephus's highly literary and theologically charged narrative, has shaped the reception of Masada for 2 millennia and continues to generate significant scholarly controversy. The central puzzle of Masada is historiographical as much as archaeological. The account of mass suicide in Josephus is the sole textual source for events that have become foundational to modern Israeli national identity, and excavations of the site by Yigael Yadin in the 1960s found human remains and material evidence consistent with Josephus's account in some respects, while raising questions in others. The famous lots, pottery sherds inscribed with names, including one inscribed Ben Yair, the name of the Sicarii commander, were found in a specific context that Yadin interpreted as the mechanism by which the final group chose the last killers. But the archaeological evidence does not unambiguously confirm mass suicide, and the number of skeletal remains recovered is far smaller than Josephus's 960. What exactly happened on Masada in 73 CE? And what does the persistent cultural need to resolve that question reveal about the relationship between historical evidence and national myth? Herod's choice of Masada as a palace and refuge site placed him in a tradition of Hasmonean and Near Eastern royal fortress building that combined luxury with paranoia in equal measure. The palace at the northern cliff face is an architectural tour de force, using the sheer drop as a structural element in a way that would be remarkable in any era. The Sicarii who occupied Masada after Herod's death and the temple's destruction were zealots in the theological sense, committed to the proposition that submission to Roman rule was a form of religious betrayal, and that death in resistance was preferable to survival in compromise. Historians and archaeologists broadly recognize the tension between the archaeological record and the Josephus account, and the scholarly literature on Masada is extensive and contentious. The site is not simply an archaeological site. It is a cultural phenomenon, the Masada complex, the idea of a last stand that becomes an act of defiance rather than defeat, has been invoked in Israeli military culture since the state's founding in ways that make dispassionate archaeological analysis politically charged. The symbolic reading of Masada moves between two poles. On one hand, the summit as a stage for the final performance of a people's refusal to become property. On the other, the same summit as a place where the logic of resistance was pushed past any point at which survival might have been possible, and where the rhetoric of noble death may have served leaders' purposes rather than the interests of the 960 people in the fortress. Some researchers working on the Herodian palace remains have noted astronomical alignments in the architectural orientation of the northern terrace that suggest Herod's architects were attentive to celestial events, perhaps as a form of royal cosmological positioning, perhaps as a practical orientation for shade and light management in a desert climate, perhaps both. Which of the human remains found at Masada belonged to the last defenders, and which may be from earlier or later periods of occupation? What was the daily life of the Sicarii community on the plateau during the 2 years of siege? How did they manage food, water, social organization, and morale while watching the Roman ramp rise against the cliff? And what would Josephus have written about Masada if he had not been a Roman prisoner at the time, with significant incentives to frame the story in specific ways? Masada does not release its visitors easily. The heat, the height, the horizon, they combine into something that feels like the beginning of a reckoning, even for those who arrive without any inherited stake in the story. The ramp is still there. The palace is still there. The silence that greeted the Roman soldiers who entered the gate is still, in its way, there. From the Judean desert, we cross the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Etruscan heartland of central Italy, where a city of the dead, carved into volcanic rock, preserves the most intimate surviving record of a civilization that Rome absorbed and Europe largely forgot. The volcanic tufa hills of coastal Lazio, north of Rome, have a particular quality in the early morning. The stone orange and warm, the pines casting long shadows across the grass that grows between the burial mounds, the sound of insects already busy even before the heat arrives. The necropolis at Cerveteri, ancient Caere, spreads across the Banditaccia plateau like a city plan made legible only in the negative. The streets are real, the pathways between the tumuli are real, but the structures they connect are not houses for the living. They are houses for the dead, and they are more numerous, better built, and more richly furnished than anything comparable in the pre-Roman world of the Western Mediterranean. The necropolis of Banditaccia at Cerveteri in Lazio, Italy, is the largest known Etruscan cemetery complex, a UNESCO World Heritage Site covering over 400 hectares of the plateau north of the ancient city of Caire. The necropolis was in active use from roughly the 7th to the 1st century BCE, its development tracking the arc of Etruscan prosperity and eventual Roman absorption. The burial tumuli, large circular mounds of earth over carved rock tomb chambers, are arranged along streets in a layout that deliberately mirrors a city of the living, with individual family tombs occupying specific plots maintained and revisited over generations. The interiors of the most elaborate tombs reproduce domestic spaces with extraordinary specificity. Carved stone beds, carved pillows, carved round shields on carved walls, carved roof beams, carved household objects, everything that a person of the Etruscan aristocratic class would have needed, rendered in rock for the permanent use of someone who would never need anything again. The puzzle of Serviteri is, paradoxically, one of intimacy rather than scale. We know more about the domestic material culture of the Etruscan aristocracy, their furniture, their clothing conventions, their architectural preferences, from these tomb interiors than from any other source, because the Etruscans carved their lives into the walls of their burial chambers with a completeness that no Etruscan house has survived to match. What is baffling is the absence of a comparable record in text. The Etruscan language, written in an adapted Greek alphabet, is partly readable, but not fully understood. We can read the sounds but cannot translate the meaning of most surviving inscriptions. Why did a civilization this sophisticated, this prosperous, this intimately connected to the Greek and Near Eastern worlds, leave so little textual self-documentation? And what does Serviteri tell us about a people whose primary surviving archive is a city built specifically for the dead? The Etruscan civilization was, for several centuries of the first millennium BCE, the dominant culture of central Italy, and arguably the most sophisticated in the western Mediterranean west of Greece. Etruscan cities controlled extensive territories. Their maritime commerce reached as far as Carthage and the Iberian coast, and their religious and artistic traditions exercised profound influence on the emerging Roman culture that would eventually supersede them. The aristocratic families who built the Serviteri tombs were among the wealthiest people in Iron Age Europe, and the grave goods recovered from the Banditaccia tombs, gold jewelry, Attic painted pottery, bronze vessels, ivory furniture, reflect commercial networks of extraordinary reach. Classicists and archaeologists treat the Serviteri necropolis primarily as an archaeological record of Etruscan elite funerary practice and material culture, a data set of exceptional richness for reconstructing economic and social history. The tomb house design is understood as reflecting a belief in the continuity of the aristocratic lifestyle beyond death. The tomb as a permanent residence, provided with everything the deceased would need for an afterlife, conceived as a continuation of earthly privilege. The religious dimension of the tomb design extends this into a cosmological statement. The Etruscan underworld, as partially recovered from funerary iconography across multiple sites, was a hierarchical place in which the dead continued to require the social markers of their earthly status. A nobleman who descended without his possessions, without his carven bed and carved shields, was not truly himself in the world below. The tomb was less a burial place than a passport. Some researchers, working on the spatial organization of the Banditaccia necropolis, have noted that the street layout and tumulus distribution follows a planning logic that may reflect cosmological rather than purely practical principles. The orientation of certain major tombs, relative to specific astronomical events, suggesting that the city of the dead was oriented in relation to the sky in ways that the city of the living may also have reflected, though the living city has not survived. How much of the Banditaccia necropolis has been excavated, and what remains under the unexcavated mounds? What would the Etruscan funerary texts, if any, survive unrecognized among the thousands of short inscriptions, tell us about the theology expressed in this architecture? And what did the last Etruscan family, to use a Banditaccia tomb, feel, placing a relative in a burial tradition that stretched back 7 generations, in a century when Rome had effectively absorbed everything that Etruscan culture had once meant? The necropolis at Cerveteri is a city that cannot be abandoned, because it was built specifically to last. The tufa chambers are cool even in summer. The carved beds hold no one visible, and the streets between the tumuli, walked by mourners for 600 years, are now walked by tourists whose presence the original builders would have found impossible to imagine, but who are, in their way, the latest generation to pay attention to the extraordinary fact of Etruscan ambition. From the Etruscan dead, we move south along the Italian coast to the most famous archaeological site in the Western world, a city frozen in time by catastrophe, the negative space of an ordinary morning, pressed into stone by the weight of a mountain. The mountain is perfectly visible from here, always was. The Campanians of the 1st century CE had been living in its shadow for generations, farming the exceptionally fertile volcanic soil of its lower slopes, drinking its groundwater, occasionally feeling the tremors that the earth sent up from below as reminders of what lay underneath the prosperity. On the morning of August 24th, 79 CE, or, as increasingly persuasive recent evidence suggests, a date in October, the mountain made its position unambiguous. The eruption lasted approximately 18 hours. The cloud that rose from Vesuvius reached a height of 33 kilometers, and underneath it, the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were not destroyed but preserved, sealed under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic material that turned, over centuries, into the most precisely timed archaeological record of any human community in history. Pompeii, in the Campania region of southern Italy near modern Naples, needs no introduction and resists reduction. It is the most excavated, most published, and most visited archaeological site in the world. A Roman city of approximately 11,000 inhabitants, frozen at a specific moment in the summer or autumn of 79 CE, yielding over 2 millennia of material evidence, including painted houses, bakeries with bread still in the ovens, electoral slogans on the walls of streets, graffiti of every variety of human expression, and the plaster casts of human and animal bodies that Giuseppe Fiorelli's 19th century technique transformed from voids in the ash into the most direct contact between the modern world and an individual ancient death that archaeology has produced. The mystery at Pompeii is not one of origin or purpose. We know what the city was, and we know how it ended. The puzzle is one of completeness and its implications. The sheer density of evidence preserved at Pompeii has produced, over 2 centuries of excavation, a picture of Roman urban life so granular that it challenges almost every prior generalization the classical tradition had made about the Roman world. The graffiti alone, over 11,000 surviving inscriptions, ranging from electoral endorsements to love poetry to economic records to the obscene and the trivial, constitute a vernacular literary archive of a kind that exists nowhere else in antiquity. What does it mean for our understanding of the ancient world that our single, most detailed and unmediated window into everyday Roman life is an accident? And what would classical scholarship look like if Pompeii had never been buried? The Pompeii of 79 CE was a prosperous, culturally heterogeneous commercial city, not a great capital, but a busy, mid-sized town whose population included Roman citizens, freed slaves, immigrants from across the Mediterranean, wealthy aristocrats in townhouses of extraordinary luxury, and working-class inhabitants living in the back rooms of shops and in rented apartments above them. The city had experienced a severe earthquake in 62 CE and was still being rebuilt when Vesuvius erupted, which means that much of what was preserved was already in a state of active renovation and transition, adding another layer of complexity to the interpretation of the material. The mainstream scholarly consensus on Pompeii has shifted substantially in recent decades, moving away from the Victorian-era reading of the city as a timeless exemplar of Roman life toward a more historically specific understanding of Pompeii as a particular city at a particular moment, with its own local politics, economic tensions, ethnic mix, and ongoing recovery from the 62 CE earthquake. The Villa of the Mysteries, the House of the Faun, the Lupanare, these are not typical Roman spaces but highly specific expressions of specific people's lives and choices. The symbolic layer at Pompeii operates differently from most ancient sites, not in the obscurity of the evidence, but in its profusion. The Lararia, household shrines, in virtually every Pompeian house reflect a domestic religious practice in which the boundary between the divine and the quotidian was essentially non-existent. The gods lived in the house, attended the meals, watched the births, and were addressed daily in the same space where bread was baked and laundry was done. Some researchers studying Pompeii's architectural, solar, and astronomical orientations have noted a consistency in the placement of atria and impluvium basins that suggests awareness of seasonal light patterns well beyond mere practical comfort, a spatial awareness of the sun's annual movement embedded in domestic architecture across the city. How many of the 11,000 residents of Pompeii survived, fled before the worst of the eruption, escaped through the harbor, made it to Stabiae or Naples on foot? What do the skeletal remains of those who did not escape tell us, through isotopic analysis, about where people in this Roman city came from, how international a population it actually was, and what is still buried under the approximately 1/3 of Pompeii that remains unexcavated? What ordinary life, what extraordinary art, what individual story pressed into the volcanic material of a Tuesday morning in 79 CE? Pompeii is the ancient world looking at us rather than the other way around. Every painted wall, every graffito, every bakery counter and garden fresco is someone specific making a specific choice in a specific moment. The distance between us and them is exactly 0. That is what the mountain, in its indiscriminate violence, accidentally gave us. From the Mediterranean's most famous catastrophe, we now travel to the far east of the ancient world, to the mausoleum of China's first emperor, where an army assembled from fired clay stands guard in underground pits that are, after decades of excavation, still not fully understood. The plains of Shanxi province in central China are dry in late autumn, the loess soil pale brown, the horizon flat in every direction. the sky enormous over the agricultural expanse. Near the town of Lintong, the low mound of Mount Li rises from the plain, with the discrete authority of a hill that is also, substantially, a man-made object, because beneath it lies the burial complex of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, and the scale of what was buried here challenges every ordinary category for what a burial is supposed to be. The terracotta army, the approximately 8,000 life-size fired clay soldiers, cavalry, and chariots arranged in 3 underground pits, was discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well. It had been underground for 2,200 years. The terracotta army at the mausoleum of the first Qin emperor near Xi'an in Shanxi province, China, is one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century and a UNESCO World Heritage Site of extraordinary significance. The 3 pits so far excavated contain an army arranged in precise military formation: infantry in columns, cavalry at the flanks, chariots with horse figures positioned for deployment. Each figure is individually modeled. The faces are distinct, varying in age, ethnic feature, and expression, in ways that scholars initially believed reflected individual portraiture, but now understand as reflecting a sophisticated system of modular part variation. The soldiers were originally painted in vivid colors, traces of which survive on protected surfaces. They carried real bronze weapons. The main tomb mound, the emperor's actual burial chamber, has not been excavated, and ancient texts describe its interior as a model of the known world, complete with rivers of mercury flowing through bronze channels. The deepest puzzle of the terracotta army is not its existence, but its logic. The practice of burying funerary substitutes, models of servants, horses, soldiers, was well established in Chinese mortuary tradition long before the Qin dynasty, typically using small ceramic figures of modest scale. Qin Shi Huang appears to have taken this tradition and expanded it to a degree that constitutes a philosophical transformation rather than a quantitative increase. 8,000 life-size soldiers, each individually characterized, armed with functional weapons, arranged in genuine military formation, constitute not a symbolic gesture, but a literal parallel army. Was the intention to provide the emperor with a real military force in the afterlife, to transfer actual military capability across the boundary of death? And if so, what does that tell us about the Qin conception of the afterlife as a place where political and military power could be meaningfully exercised? Qin Shi Huang's achievement, the unification of the 7 warring states of China into a single empire in 221 BCE, was the most consequential political event in Chinese history, the founding act of a political tradition that persisted in various forms until 1912. The emperor, who created the standardized weights and measures, the unified writing system, and the first version of the Great Wall, was also, by the accounts of later Chinese historians, a man of profound death anxiety, who dispatched envoys to find an elixir of immortality, and who apparently believed that the boundary between living and dead could be negotiated, perhaps managed, by sufficient preparation. Scholars broadly interpret the terracotta army as the physical expression of imperial ideology, the extension of the emperor's earthly power into the afterlife, as a cosmological claim, consistent with a worldview in which the son of heaven's authority was not merely political, but cosmic. The army's precise military organization reflects the actual Qin military formation doctrine. The emperor was, in effect, taking his army with him rather than leaving it behind. A more ritual reading focuses on the relationship between the army and its enemy. Who was the terracotta army deployed to fight in the afterlife? Several researchers have proposed that the military formation of the pits is oriented specifically toward the east, consistent with the direction from which the kingdoms Qin Shi Huang had launched their greatest threats, suggesting that the army was positioned to continue protecting the emperor from the remembered enemies of his living campaigns. The Mercury rivers described in ancient texts as part of the main tomb's interior have been partly corroborated by soil surveys detecting elevated mercury concentrations around the unexcavated mound, raising extraordinary questions about the engineering involved in creating a hydraulic system for a liquid metal inside a sealed underground chamber, and about what else the tomb's ancient architects may have designed into a space that no modern eye has yet seen. How many more pits are there, undetected, beneath the Lintong Plain? What condition are the pigments on the soldiers in the unexcavated sections of the known pits? Can conservation technology now preserve them better than the 1970s excavations managed? And what lies inside the burial mound itself? Does the mercury cosmology described by Sima Qian actually exist? And if it does, what does that say about the engineers who made it? The terracotta army faces east in its underground chambers. The emperor faces whatever the afterlife prepared for him, with 8,000 clay soldiers at his back and the weight of the first Chinese unified state in his hands. Whether that was sufficient for whatever he encountered, history does not record. For our final site, we travel west from China, across the Eurasian heartland and south through the Arabian Peninsula, arriving at last in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, where the most famous archaeological discovery of the 20th century still generates debate, still yields new information, and still has not given up all its secrets. The Valley of the Kings lies on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, in a fold of the limestone cliffs above the Thaban Plain, a dry, white, heat-struck gully that receives very little shadow and almost no wind. The rock is pale and fractured. The numbered entrances to the tombs are cut directly into the cliff face. In November 1922, Howard Carter's team broke through the sealed plaster wall at the bottom of a staircase cut into the valley floor and found a passage filled with rubble, and then a second sealed door, and then, on November 26th, when Carter made a small breach and held a candle into the darkness beyond, the sight that he described with habitual English understatement as wonderful things. Gold, everywhere gold. Tutankhamun's tomb, KV-62 in the Valley of the Kings designation system, is the most intact royal burial ever found in Egypt, and Howard Carter's discovery of it in 1922 remains the single most celebrated moment in the history of archaeology. The tomb contained over 5,000 individual objects. 3 nested coffins, the innermost of solid gold, a solid gold funerary mask, canopic jars, chariots, weapons, clothing, food offerings, board games, jewelry, furniture, musical instruments, and 2 small coffins containing the mummified remains of 2 fetuses believed to be Tutankhamun's daughters. The king himself, buried within the innermost gold coffin, was a young man. Modern analysis places his age at death between 17 and 20 years old, who ruled Egypt for approximately 9 years during the later 18th dynasty, around 1332 to 1323 BCE. The central enigma of Tutankhamun's tomb is not the famous gold, but what the objects collectively reveal and conceal, about a pivotal and extremely strange moment in Egyptian history. Tutankhamun came to power in the immediate aftermath of the Amarna period, the reign of Akhenaten, who had dismantled the traditional Egyptian polytheistic system, expelled the Amun priesthood from power, moved the capital to a new city, and imposed a radical monotheistic or near-monotheistic solar religion on the empire. Tutankhamun, who had himself been born with the name Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, early in his reign, and presided over the restoration of the traditional religion and the dismantling of Akhenaten's city. The objects in his tomb reflect this complex inheritance. Amarna period artistic innovations sit alongside the restored traditional iconography in ways that suggest a court still negotiating between two irreconcilable theological worlds. Who was actually governing Egypt during Tutankhamun's reign? The boy king, or the powerful officials Ai and Horemheb who succeeded him and may have managed the restoration while he was still a child? And why did Tutankhamun die so young? The 18th dynasty, which produced both Akhenaten's revolution and Tutankhamun's restoration, was the most internationally connected and politically dynamic period of New Kingdom Egypt, a time of extraordinary wealth, military expansion, and diplomatic complexity, in which Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters with Hittite kings as equals, sent gold to Mesopotamian rulers as currency, and received foreign princesses as wives. The court at Thebes was a cosmopolitan world of competing interests, theological positions, and political factions. And Tutankhamun's brief reign sits at the exact inflection point where one world ended and another reasserted itself. The mainstream scholarly debate about Tutankhamun focuses on several specific questions. His cause of death. Proposed explanations include malaria, a leg fracture that became infected, a genetic disorder exacerbated by royal inbreeding, or some combination, the degree to which he actually exercised royal power versus serving as a figurehead, and the question of whether his tomb, notably small for a pharaoh's burial and apparently hastily completed, represents a prepared burial that was rushed, or an entirely improvised response to an unexpected early death. The symbolic reading of the tomb contents reveals an extraordinary theological program. The objects are not merely provisions for the afterlife, but a cosmological argument, each piece carefully chosen to equip the king for the specific challenges of the solar journey, the traversal of the 12 hours of night, the daily rebirth with the sun, the nesting of coffins within shrines within a gilded sarcophagus is a set of nested cosmological boundaries, each one a universe within a universe. The king at the center of a material model of creation. The speculation that will not be silenced involves a possible hidden chamber adjacent to KV-62. Scans conducted between 2015 and 2018 have produced results that some researchers interpret as evidence of a void or additional room, possibly containing the burial of Nefertiti or another major figure of the Amarna period. This interpretation remains highly contested, and subsequent analysis has moderated earlier enthusiasm. But the possibility, however remote, of an undiscovered 18th dynasty royal burial adjacent to the most famous tomb in Egypt is the kind of idea that does not fully leave the room. What would a complete genetic analysis of all identifiable 18th dynasty royal mummies tell us about the specific family relationships of Tutankhamun's immediate relatives, and would it resolve the question of Akhenaten's parentage? What happened to the objects looted from Tutankhamun's tomb before Carter's arrival? At least 2 ancient intrusions into Cave I-62 have been identified. And where are they now? And what was the last thought of the young man in the gold coffin, in the tomb in the limestone valley, as the lid was lowered for the last time? Tutankhamun was 17. He ruled the most powerful empire on earth, and everything he knew about life and death was preserved in the objects they placed around him. A theology in gold and alabaster, a universe compressed into 3 nested rooms, cut into the bedrock of a dry valley in Upper Egypt. Howard Carter held his candle up to the breach in the plastered wall and saw wonderful things. We are still looking. What this journey reveals is not a collection of separate destinations, but a single, continuous human pattern stretching across time. Different continents, different climates, different cultures that never met each other. And yet, beneath all of that separation, the same impulse keeps appearing again and again. The urge to leave a trace behind in a world that does not preserve anything by default. Sometimes that trace takes the form of massive stone arrangements, placed with a precision that suggests intention rather than chance. Sometimes it becomes entire settlements, built in locations that demanded enormous effort just to survive in. Sometimes it is carved into rock faces, or aligned with celestial movement, or hidden in landscapes that have since changed so completely that only fragments remain. And sometimes it survives only as absence, places where something once stood, but time has already finished the work of removal. At first glance, it is easy to describe all of this as history, as archaeology, as architecture. But the deeper you look, the less satisfying those labels become, because what remains is not just structure. It is intention, made physical. It is effort, preserved beyond the life of the people who made it. It is meaning that refused to stay contained within a single lifetime. Every one of these places carries the same contradiction inside it. They were built by people who knew they would not last forever, and yet they built as if something about them could. That contradiction is what makes them still feel alive today, because even now, standing in front of what remains, we are not only looking backward, we are also recognizing something familiar, the desire to be remembered, the desire for meaning to survive its maker, the desire to leave behind proof that a life was lived, and that it mattered enough to take shape in the world. And yet, time does not preserve intention as it was originally meant. It transforms it. It removes context. It erases voices. It strips away explanation until only form remains. What was once a living place of meaning becomes something quieter, a question without its answer. But perhaps that is exactly why these places continue to matter, because they do not only tell us what was built, they show us what building itself says about us, that humans are not only observers of the world, but participants in it, that we do not simply inhabit time, but try to negotiate with it, that we are constantly aware, even if only instinctively, that everything we experience will eventually become part of what came before. And still, we continue. We continue to build things we know may not last. We continue to create meaning even when meaning is not guaranteed to survive. We continue to speak, to write, to carve, to construct, to remember, even though forgetting is inevitable. There is something both fragile and extraordinary in that persistence. It suggests that the purpose was never perfection and never permanence. The purpose was the act itself, the decision to create something in a world that is always moving toward disappearance. And so these places remain, not as answers, but as evidence of a question humanity has never stopped asking. A question that does not belong to any single civilization, or era, or belief system. A question that seems to repeat itself every time human beings look at the horizon and wonder what, if anything, can remain of them when they are no longer here to hold their own memories. If everything eventually returns to silence, then what exactly are we trying to say into it? And more importantly, who are we hoping will hear it? Perhaps there is no final answer, only the continuation of the attempt, because even silence, when shaped by human hands, does not feel empty. It feels marked. It feels intentional. It feels like something was left there on purpose, even if we can no longer fully understand what it was meant to say. And maybe that is enough. Not clarity, not resolution, but recognition that we have always been part of something larger than our individual moment, and that every trace we leave is both a question and a reminder. If you have reached this far, take a moment to leave a comment and share which part of this journey stayed with you the most, and why it stayed. Not as a conclusion, but as part of the same ongoing reflection that these places have carried for thousands of years. And if you want to continue this exploration beyond what is known, beyond what is explained, and into what still remains uncertain, subscribe to Sleep Through the Unknown, because nothing here is truly finished, only carried forward.